A woman tied to a fence post. Morning light, a man in a pressed vest raising a leather strap with the patience of someone doing yard work before breakfast, no anger on his face. That was the thing. On the ridge above, a rider stopped. Not because he planned to, because his horse stopped first. The sound that reached him wasn't a scream. It was quieter than that. The sound a person made when they had learned, a long time ago, that screaming changed nothing. The rider sat still for 30 seconds, then he turned off the road. He had a rule about this. He had built 3 years of his life around this rule. He had very good reasons for this rule. He turned off the road anyway. And somewhere below, in the yard of the big house with the curtains drawn tight, the man in the pressed vest looked up. Their eyes met. The woman raised her head. The morning Cole Hargrove rode into Rimrock, New Mexico territory. He heard the sound before he saw anything wrong. That was the thing that stopped him, not the sight of it. The sound. He'd crested the low ridge above town at first light, the November cold sitting hard on the mesa the way it did at elevation, not wet, not negotiable, just present, absolute. Decker moved underneath him with the easy, ground-covering stride of a horse that had learned its rider wasn't going to ask for speed without reason, and Cole had been giving him no reason. The road into Rimrock ran straight and flat across the valley floor, the kind of road that asked nothing of you, just ride through. Keep your eyes on what's ahead. Get where you're going before the cold decided to get serious. He'd been doing exactly that for 3 years. Rimrock sat at the eastern edge of a long, shallow valley. The kind of valley New Mexico territory scattered between its serious geography like afterthoughts. Red rock on the southern rim, scrub cedar climbing the northern slope, and in between a stretch of dusty flat that the town occupied with the resigned permanence of something that had been set down and had stopped expecting to be moved. The buildings were what you expected from a territorial town in its middle years dry goods store, saloon, a church losing a slow argument with its own foundation, a sheriff's office sitting dead center on Main Street with the self-importance of a building that believed it ran things. Everyone in Rimrock understood that the building belonged to the law, while the law itself belonged to someone else entirely. Cole didn't know that yet. He was here for Jonas Webb. $400 owed since a poker game in Socorro 3 years back. When Jonas had written a marker on credit he didn't have and signed it with the serene confidence of a man who planned to be somewhere else by morning. Jonas had been somewhere else by morning. Several somewhere elses, in fact, across 3 years and as many territorial districts. But $400 didn't expire. And a month ago Cole had heard through the informal network of trading posts and way stations that Jonas Webb had settled in Rimrock with a wife, a dry goods operation, and apparently a revised theory about whether old debts counted. They did. Cole wasn't sentimental about money, but he was precise about what was owed, and precision was one of the few things he still trusted about himself. He was almost past the ridge when Decker slowed, not stopped. Slowed, with the specific quality of a horse whose ears had moved before his riders had, swiveling forward with the fine-tuned attention of an animal that distinguished between sounds worth noting and sounds worth stopping for. Cole gave him rein. He trusted Decker's ears the way he trusted the hunting knife on his left hip, because both of them had been right in situations where being wrong had permanent consequences. He listened. The wind was dead flat that morning. Nothing stirring in the cedar. And underneath all that stillness, underneath the cold and the silence, he could hear it. Not loud, not the kind of sound that carried across open country and grabbed your collar. Smaller than that. The sound a person made when they'd learned. Through the long practice, that bigger sounds didn't change anything, rhythmic, deliberate. The sound of something striking something that couldn't strike back. Cole sat on Decker for 30 full seconds. He thought about Jonas Webb and $400 and being in Albuquerque by Thursday. He thought about how the road ran right past the source of that sound, and how a man who kept his eyes on the road ahead didn't have to look at what was beside it. He'd been keeping his eyes on the road ahead for 3 years. Since the afternoon he'd ridden home to Laramie, Wyoming, after a 9-day pursuit of a fugitive that had ended in Cheyenne with irons and a cell and everything done correctly, and had found 2 graves in the churchyard that hadn't been there when he left, his wife Sarah, their son Billy 4 years old. Typhoid, the neighbor told him, fast. Both of them gone before the 3rd day. He'd been 300 miles away closing a case when it happened, and the case had been closed and his family had been buried, and those two fags had existed side by side in him ever since without ever becoming compatible. He'd handed his badge back across the desk in Albuquerque 8 months after that. Hadn't said anything, hadn't needed to. Since then, he kept moving. He took what work he needed, collected what was owed him, and made it a point not to stop for things that weren't his problem. He'd become very good at it. Decker turned off the road. Cole wasn't sure if he gave the rein or the horse took it. He'd never be able to sort that out, and eventually he stopped trying. The Cade property sat at the eastern edge of the valley like something built with money and maintained with indifference. The main house was 2 stories, solid, enough glass in the windows to show someone had paid for quality once. The yard was large and swept, and completely without anything soft, no kitchen garden. No flowers, no evidence that anyone had decided to make the place livable rather than merely functional. Even the dirt around the fence posts had a beaten quality, compacted by years into something harder than earth usually got on its own. Cole saw the woman first. She was tied to the corner fence post, both wrists, the rope pulled tight enough that her hands had gone pale above the knots. Her chin was down, dark honey-colored hair loose around her face. She wore a cotton work dress the color of old ash, the practical kind, not the company kind, and across the back of it, fresh dark lines marked the fabric in parallel. The man standing in front of her was perhaps 52, broad through the shoulders, the kind of broad that had once been physical and had converted over the years into something harder to name, authority wearing a body. He was dressed as though he had a meeting afterward, vest pressed, trousers clean, shoes that had been polished that morning. He held a length of folded leather in his right hand and was applying it with the patient, measured consistency of a man performing a task before breakfast, not angry. That was what stopped Cole's blood cold in his chest. An angry man was out of control, which meant an angry man was at least partially readable. This man's face showed nothing but the mild focus of someone confirming a calculation they'd already made. The woman absorbed each blow without flinching much, without crying out, breathing in the controlled exhale of someone who had, over time, developed a system for enduring what she couldn't prevent. The sound of it was so much worse than any sound she could have made. Cole walked Decker through the gate. The latch was unlocked. He didn't announce himself. A large horse on hard-packed dirt announced him fine. The man heard Decker before Cole was halfway across the yard and turned without hurrying, without anything on his face that resembled guilt or alarm. He turned the way a landowner turned when someone had walked onto his property without an invitation, annoyed. Proprietorial, private property. The voice was flat and even, the voice of a man whose statements had been received as final for long enough that he'd stopped differentiating between statement and command. Roads back that way, Cole stopped Decker 10 feet out and stayed in the saddle. He looked at the woman tied to the post, at the fresh marks on the back of her dress, at her hands, pale above the rope knots. She hadn't looked up yet. Your daughter? He kept his voice the same way he kept his hands, easy, visible, no extra information. My concern, the man's gaze was flat and measuring, filing Cole into a category. Not yours, that should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment Cole touched his hat brim and turned Decker back toward the road, because none of this was his business, and he had spent 3 years learning not to have business that wasn't his. He had rules. He had reasons for his rules. He had 2 graves in Laramie that were the reason for his reasons. Then the woman raised her head. Cole stopped breathing in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He knew those eyes, not from Rimrock, not from anything connected to the man standing in front of him. He knew them from a night 8 months ago on the Sangre de Cristo Pass, in a late-season storm that had come off the peaks without warning and dropped the temperature so fast the air itself seemed to solidify. Decker had shied at something in the dark, a sound, a shadow. Something that wasn't there and gone sideways off the trail on a section that didn't have much shoulder to go sideways onto. Cole had gone with him, down a rocky slope he couldn't see, and his head had connected with something solid on the way down. The next thing he remembered was firelight, small fire built in the shallow notch of a rock overhang on the eastern cliff face. He was inside it, out of the wind. A blanket over him that wasn't his heavier than his, smelling of wood smoke and cedar. He was alone. But the fire was recent and deliberate, the wood placement of someone who knew what they were doing and had done it quickly. Someone had found him at the bottom of that slope in the dark and the driving snow and had gotten him up to shelter, which at 240 pounds was not an incidental project, and had built him a fire and covered him, and left before he woke up. The snow outside the overhang held the impressions of boot prints, small and already filling with drift. He'd followed them for half a mile before the wind covered them over. He'd thought about those prints for months afterward, the way unexplained kindness from a stranger lingered, not sentimental, just present, with the weight of something unfinished. He'd asked about it at every trading post and settlement he'd passed through since, describing the size of the prints and the skill of the fire and the particular way the blanket had been tucked under his chin, as though someone had been careful about it. Nobody had known anything, or nobody had said anything. In the territory, those were sometimes the same thing. The eyes looking at him now above the fence post rope were grey-blue and watchful and completely, precisely alert. Not the flat eyes of someone beaten past caring. The eyes of someone who had spent years turning observation into a resource, cataloguing everything because information was the only thing she had free and clear. They were looking at him now with something that wasn't recognition, more like calculation. She was already working out what variable he represented. He was perhaps 60% certain. He'd been half dead in a snowstorm with a head injury and hadn't seen her face. But 60% was enough to stay on the property. I want to buy her. The words came out before anything more calibrated occurred to him, which was not how he'd intended to handle this. He'd spent 10 years as a United States Marshal talking to dangerous men with patience and precision. But those eyes had knocked the patience sideways. The man stared at him with the slow, settling quality of someone whose mental machinery had just reclassified an unexpected input. Buy her, her contract, whatever arrangement you have in place. Name your price. Something shifted in the flat annoyance, not to anger, not to indignation, to something colder and more operational. The look of a man running new numbers. She's not a horse. No, Cole agreed. Horses get treated better. The air in the yard changed. He'd learned to feel the moment when a conversation crossed into territory it couldn't cross back from 10 years of standing across from men who were deciding whether to do something he didn't want them to do had given him that particular sensitivity. This was one of those moments. The man looked at Cole with new eyes, taking a different kind of measure. Who are you? Not casual inquiry. Data collection. Nobody in particular. Nobody in particular doesn't ride onto my property and make offers for my family. And yet here I am, Cole said, and kept his hands easy and his voice level, because this was the knife-edge moment, the part where everything that came next depended on which way the man decided it went. Cole needed him to see a resource, not a threat, not a lawman, something he could use. The man folded the leather strap he was holding, once, twice, methodically, thinking. You know something about a legal matter. It wasn't a question. He was laying out pieces, watching which ones Cole picked up. A property transfer. Document that Thomas Aldrin signed before he died. Supposed to deed some grazing land to competing interests. The hair on the back of Cole's neck went very still. Thomas Aldrin had sent him that document 5 years ago, 3 months before the fire. A sealed letter with a folded paper inside it, the letter written in Thomas's careful, deliberate hand. I don't trust the courts here. I don't trust the judges they've appointed or the lawyers watching the judges. I trust you because you did right by my neighbor in the Colfax matter when nobody else would and asked nothing afterward. Keep this safe until the time is right. I don't know when that will be. I'll know it when I see it, and if I don't see it, I believe you will. Thomas Aldrin and his family had died in a fire 2 months after writing that letter. His wife Eleanor, their son James, 4 years old, their daughter Clara, 7. A ranch hand named Pete Sully who'd been sleeping in the barn and never had a chance at a choice. Cole had kept that document in the inside pocket of his coat ever since. Through 2 more years of active martial work. Through the afternoon he'd handed his badge back without a word. Through 3 years of moving without stopping. He'd carried it the way you carried something that felt wrong to put down, not because you knew exactly what to do with it, but because releasing it felt like letting something unfinished go unfinished forever. He understood several things very quickly. Standing in Warren Cade's yard, I've heard about a document, Cole said carefully. The kind that creates complications for people who'd prefer not to have them. Warren's eyes were running their calculations. A man matching your description was asking about that document in Albuquerque 6 months back. And before that, in Las Cruces, So Warren had been looking for him, which meant Warren had known for some time that the document existed and had left the property, which meant he'd been tracking it with the patient, methodical attention of a man who did not rush things but also did not let them go. "You give me that document," Warren said, and the pleasantness in his voice was the most dangerous thing about him, "and we'll talk about the girl." Cole looked at the woman tied to the post. She was watching him, still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken. Working her calculations with those alert grey-blue eyes, running the variables. Who was this? What did he want? Was this better or worse than what was already happening? Cole reached inside his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it toward Warren. Warren crossed the yard without hurrying, took the paper, unfolded it, read it with the deliberate attention of a man who had spent his life reading contracts and finding the clause that gave and the clause that took back. He folded it again and put it in his vest pocket. "Deal," he said. What Warren Cade did not know in the 3 seconds between naming his price and Cole reaching into his coat was that the paper now in his pocket was not the original document. It was a copy. Cole had made 2 copies in Albuquerque 4.5 years ago, in the weeks after Thomas Aldrin's letter arrived, because 10 years as a United States Marshal had taught him that original documents had a way of disappearing when inconvenient people got hold of them, and the disappearance was always afterward described as accidental. The original was in a sealed envelope in Decker's left saddlebag, addressed to the territorial judge in Santa Fe, with a cover letter explaining everything Cole knew and suspected about the fire that had killed 5 people on the Aldrin property. That letter had been written across 5 years, revised twice, and finalized the morning he'd left the last trading post before Rimrock. It needed to go south with the first reliable rider he could find. He was beginning to understand that the timing of all of it was not coincidental. Warren reached for the rope at the woman's wrists, then stopped, turned to face Cole, still on Decker. One thing, the business tone held, but something underneath it had started moving, something that had nothing to do with documents or deals. "A moment with my daughter. Say goodbye properly. A man's entitled to that much." Cole looked at him. Every instinct he had said no. He heard the word goodbye and understood precisely what kind Warren Cade meant to give. The kind designed to travel with a person. The kind meant to remind her, every time she moved wrong, that distance didn't change ownership. "Step back," Cole said quietly. Warren tilted his head, the near-polite gesture of a man who had not received the response he expected. "Beg your pardon, step back. The deal is made. That means she's already not yours." The calculation in Warren's face went briefly, visibly cold, then settled into something that was not a retreat, but was absolutely a postponement, the decision of a man measuring the cost of a confrontation now against the conditions a later confrontation might offer. He stepped back. It was not surrender. Both of them knew what it was. Cole dismounted, walked to the fence post, and cut the rope at the woman's wrists with his hunting knife because the knots were too thick to untie quickly, and he wanted her free fast. When the ropes fell away, her hands dropped to her sides. She didn't reach for the post for balance, though she needed it. She didn't reach for Cole. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and her eyes on Warren's back, not on Cole. On Warren. Even now, even with her wrists free, she was watching the known threat, because the known threat was the predictable thing, and the predictable thing was manageable. A stranger who'd just bought her freedom was something she didn't have a category for yet. "Can you ride?" Cole kept his voice low. She didn't answer. He turned and walked Decker toward the gate, moving steady, not reaching back, not checking over his shoulder, just going, and trusting that a woman intelligent enough to build a fire in a blizzard for a stranger she didn't know was intelligent enough to recognize a clear exit when one was offered. She was right behind him. At the gate, Cole stopped Decker and offered his hand. She looked at it for a moment, not with suspicion exactly, more with the deliberate consideration of someone who had learned not to take anything at face value, including offered hands. Then she took it and let him help her up behind him. Her hands rested on his sides with the lightest possible contact, like she'd spent years learning to take up as little space as possible, and the habit was still running even now that the reason for it had temporarily changed. Cole looked back once before he rode out. Warren Cade stood at the edge of his porch, arms at his sides, watching them go with a small, settled smile, not the calculating expression he'd worn through the negotiation. not the brief flash of cold when Cole had refused him his moment at the post. This was something smaller and more patient. The smile of a man who had already made his next move and was content to let the board develop. That smile stayed with Cole for a long time after the gate was behind them. Ruth Mercer found them at the bend in the road half a mile east of the Cade property, as though she'd known to be there. She was sitting on a flat rock at the curve with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes already on the woman behind Cole before Decker had fully rounded the bend. Ruth was 60, built the way hard decades, built women who couldn't afford to fall apart, square in the shoulders, direct in the eye, gray hair pulled back tight. She wore a wool work dress and heavy boots, and a coat that had been well made once and had been used far more than it had been rested. She looked at Cole with the measured attention of a woman who had developed, over a long life, an excellent sense of which men were worth trusting and was still in the process of rendering her verdict. She spoke first to the woman behind him, not to Cole past him entirely, as though he hadn't yet earned the right to be addressed directly, and she was comfortable with that assessment. Whatever she said was quiet and specific. The woman behind Cole made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between breath and acknowledgement, carrying more information than either alone, and Ruth's face changed. Small shifts, but Cole had spent 10 years reading faces under pressure, and small shifts were often the ones that told you the most. Something that had been held very carefully loosened, and underneath it was not grief exactly, but the thing grief kept company with in the long years after the worst had already happened. Ruth stood and came to the horse and reached up to touch the woman's face with one careful hand. She looked at the bruising at the jaw, looked at the rope marks still bright on her wrists, made a sound in her throat that had no words in any language Cole recognized, but was absolutely clear in its meaning. Then she looked at him. You took her from Warren Cade, not an accusation. Confirmation of a fact she was placing into the correct category. We made an arrangement. Warren Cade doesn't make arrangements. Ruth's English was precise, unhurried, the speech of someone who chose words because they meant things. He makes situations, then he waits for them to resolve in his favor. Cole said nothing, because she wasn't wrong, and he'd known she wasn't wrong since he'd seen that smile at the edge of the porch. I'm Ruth Mercer. I have a house at the east edge of town. She'll come with me, she can rest, heal. Ruth looked at him steadily. And you, Cole Hargrove? I have some things to work out in Rimrock, starting with a man named Jonas Webb and $400. Something moved through Ruth's expression, rapid and settling like a card turning over. Former Marshal Albuquerque District. Former, he agreed. She studied him a moment longer, filing him into her final category. Whatever it was, whatever she decided, it appeared to satisfy or at least not disqualify. She reached up to help the woman down from Decker, and the woman came down with a steadiness that was not ease but was the practiced competence of a body trained by necessity to function through whatever it was feeling. Warren won't act against me directly, Ruth said, for Cole's benefit, as she settled the woman beside her. He's not foolish enough to make an enemy of the only person in this county who knows medicine. But stay away from his people while you work your business here. She paused. The last man who came to Rimrock asking questions about the Aldrin fire left on foot and left quickly. Cole looked at her. What fire? Ruth looked back at him, and in her expression was the particular quality of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask that question in exactly the right tone of voice. Walk with me, she said, and turned east toward town. The woman she still hadn't given him. Her name moved with Ruth slightly behind and to the left, the unconscious positioning of someone accustomed to keeping to the edge of things. She hadn't looked directly at Cole since the fence post. She was watching the road, the sky, the scrub cedar on the ridge, everywhere except at the man who'd just altered the terms of her situation. Cole understood it. He was an unknown quantity to her, and unknown quantities required careful monitoring before they earned anything else. Ruth talked while they walked, because Ruth, Cole was already learning, did not waste time on preamble when there were actual things to say. Thomas and Eleanor Aldrin had ranched in Rimrock for 12 years. Decent people, Ruth said, with the simplicity of someone who considered that sufficient characterization and didn't need to elaborate. Thomas had run a mixed operation cattle, some dry goods trading, a spread of good grazing land on the east-facing slope that the Cade operation had wanted for the better part of a decade. Warren had made offers. Thomas had declined. Warren had made different kinds of offers. Thomas had declined those too then. 2 months after Thomas completed a legal transfer document granting certain grazing rights back to the eastern property holders. A document that Warren Cade had been trying to prevent and had been told did not exist. There was a fire. 5 people. Thomas, Eleanor, James, who was 4, Clara, who was 7, and Pete Sully, who'd been sleeping in the barn. The sheriff investigated, Ruth said, and the word investigated in her mouth meant something other than its dictionary definition. Ruled it accidental. Lamp fire. Inside 4 days, that's fast, Cole said. Very, Ruth said. The woman walking slightly behind them made a small sound, not a word, but it had the texture of something held down that had slipped a fraction. Cole filed it, said nothing. They reached Ruth's property as the morning was fully establishing itself, a small house set back from the eastern road. Solid and practical. Kitchen, garden, put to bed for winter. Fence in good repair. The overall impression of a place maintained by someone with standards and the means to enforce them. Ruth opened the gate and gestured both of them through. Inside, she put a kettle on with the efficiency of someone who did things in the right order because she'd worked out what the right order was. She gestured at the table. Cole sat on one side. The woman sat at the far corner, the seat that gave her a clear line to the door. Cole noticed. He thought she noticed him noticing. Neither of them said anything about it. Her hands were on the table. The rope marks on her wrists were red and distinct, the skin abraded in the pattern of rope under sustained tension. She was looking at them with the slightly detached attention of someone examining damage that was theirs but that they'd achieved enough distance from to observe rather than feel. Ruth set mugs on the table and sat. She looked at Cole with the direct, undecorated attention of a woman who had learned that directness cost less over time than everything else. Former Marshal, she said. Not a question this time. An opening, 10 years. Albuquerque District. He looked at the mug in front of him. I resigned 2 years ago. Why? Personal reasons. She didn't push it. People who said personal reasons meant them, and Ruth was the kind of person who understood that. And you came to Rimrock for Jonas Webb's debt. That's what I came for. Is it still what you're here for? Cole looked up. The woman was looking at him. For the first time since the yard directly, those grey-blue eyes doing the full calculative work he'd first seen when she raised her head above the fence post. There was something forming in the look, not a question yet, but the shape of one, watching him the way you watch something you hadn't finished deciding about. June Whitfield, she said. She hadn't been asked. She'd decided to say it. He nodded. Cole Hargrove, she already knew that. She nodded anyway, the small acknowledgement of someone accepting information as confirmed rather than new. He'll say I'm lying. Her voice was even, not resigned, not heated. Simply accurate, the way she seemed to prefer to be. He'll go to the saloon tonight and talk to the men he drinks with. And by tomorrow, every household in Rimrock will have heard that I'm not right in the head, that I make up stories, that he's been patient about it for years. He's built that story before. He's kept it ready. Cole looked at her. Has it worked before? I've never said anything before, a pause that carried weight. So the story has never had to work. It's only needed to exist. Ruth wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at Cole with the focused attention she gave to things she considered worth solving. Thomas Aldrin's document, she said. What do you know? This was the moment, Cole understood, where he either said what he actually knew or he didn't, and everything that followed would proceed from that choice. He looked at these 2 women at Ruth's kitchen table. One of them 60 years old with the eyes of someone who had been waiting for the right variable. One of them 20, with rope marks on her wrists and the stillness of someone who had been keeping something very large, very quiet for a very long time, and he made the choice he'd been circling since the sound on the ridge. Thomas sent me a document 3 months before the fire, he said. He watched their faces as he said it. Ruth settled, something confirmed, something into place. June's moved through something more complex. Recognition, and behind it, something heavier than recognition. He asked me to keep it safe until the right time. He said he didn't trust the local courts. He said he trusted me. The deed transfer, Ruth said. Eleanor told me about it, Ruth continued, when Cole nodded. Thomas told Eleanor. They were worried. In the last weeks, Thomas kept saying he felt watched. Cole's hands were flat on the table. The document grants specific grazing rights back to the eastern property holders. It's a legal transfer, properly witnessed. If it holds, Warren Cade loses access to the best spring water grazing in the valley, and a full title review would show he's been running cattle on land he doesn't actually hold clear deed to for 8 years, including this past year, during which he's quietly been working a silver vein on the contested section. Silence in the kitchen. The kettle settled on the stove. June was looking at the table. Then she looked up, and what was in her face had not been there before, something that had been kept below the surface and had come part way up when he said Thomas Aldrin's name. He was kind, she said. Mr. Aldrin. He used to put extra sugar in the bag when my mother traded with him. Never mentioned it. Never asked for anything for it. Just more sugar than was paid for. A brief pause. We counted things carefully, we had to. So I always noticed. Cole said nothing. Some things deserved the space of not being immediately responded to. He's been dead 5 years, June said, and the steadiness of her voice was doing active work now, holding something in line that wanted to go elsewhere. You've been carrying his paper for 5 years. Yes, why? Because the fire felt wrong. The timing felt wrong. The way the investigation closed in 4 days felt wrong. He looked at her directly. I couldn't prove anything at the time. And I couldn't stay in the district indefinitely. But I couldn't let go of it either. Some things you carry until you understand what you're supposed to do with them. June held his gaze for a long time, those gray-blue eyes reading for the thing behind the thing he'd said. Then she looked down at her hands, at the marks on her wrists, at the table grain, then back up. I was there, she said. The kitchen went very still. Ruth set down her mug with the careful quiet of someone who understood that what was coming next needed room. 15, June said. I was 15. Warren came to my room before it was light and told me to dress. Said we were taking a drive. Her voice had taken on the quality of someone narrating from slightly above the thing they were narrating, because staying inside it while telling it was not survivable. I didn't ask where. I had learned not to ask. Asking cost more than it was worth. She paused. I smelled it when I climbed onto the wagon, the kerosene. I didn't know what it meant, I understand now. Cole kept his face completely still. The discipline of a decade applied to this. She told him about the road to the Aldrin property in the dark. About Thomas Aldrin opening the door, surprised, doing his best to be hospitable about an unexpected late visit from a neighbor. About Eleanor in the doorway behind him, and the children being woken, James asking from the top of the stairs if he could go back to bed. About the walk to the barn. About going to the barn because Warren said one of the horses had taken sick and Thomas would want to see to it. About the sound of the bar going across the outside of the door. She said, the sounds after, with 2 words, and stopped there. Cole was grateful she stopped there, because some things, once described in detail, lived in the listener forever, and he didn't need them living in him to do what he was going to do. He drove us home, she said. Both hands on the reins, calm. He didn't look at me once on the road back. When we pulled into the yard, he turned and he said, and here the evenness of her voice cracked at its edge, just for a moment, then pulled itself back into line, he said, now you know what happens to people who have things I need. She held his gaze. I was 15 years old. I believed him completely. I believed that if I said one word, it would happen to someone else I cared about. Ruth's hand moved across the table and covered June's. She didn't speak. It was the wrong calculation, June said, and her voice was flat again, the voice of someone who had done the accounting honestly and arrived at an answer she didn't like. My silence didn't make anyone safer. It only gave him more time. She looked at Cole. What are you going to do? He looked at the document in his coat and at the marks on her wrists and at Ruth's face across the table. There's a man, he said, Walt Briggs. He was there that night, second wagon. He disappeared the morning after the fire. Ruth and June looked at each other briefly. Something passed between them, the shared knowledge of people who had talked about this before. He's north, Ruth said. Mining camp called Copper Ridge. About 120 miles. He's been using a different name. He's a witness, Cole said. He's a frightened man, Ruth said. Frightened men sometimes choose truth when someone makes the cost of refusing it higher than the cost of telling it. June was looking at Cole steadily. What are you going to do with all of it? She wasn't asking about Walt Briggs now. She was asking about the larger shape of what he was building. You can't take it through the local court. Warren owns the circuit judge, I know. What I can do is take it somewhere. Warren can't manage it. A public hearing in the town square. Not a trial, a hearing. 200 people hear the same thing at the same time. Warren can manage judges and sheriffs. He can't revise the memory of 200 witnesses simultaneously. June was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to be part of it. Not the person things happen around while other people make decisions. Her voice had the particular quality of something that had been decided some time ago, and was now simply being said. I want to be there when it ends. Cole looked at her. He thought of several reasons that was complicated. He thought of boot prints in snow, leading away from a cave in a blizzard, small, precise, and gone before he could follow them to their source. All right, he said. She nodded once, the clean nod she used for things that were settled. Then go find Jonas Webb, she said. You came here for $400. Collect it. And while you're moving around this town, listen to what it sounds like when it talks about Warren Cade. Cole stood, settled his coat, and went out to do exactly that. Jonas Webb turned out to be exactly the kind of man who owed people money. Then, apologetic in the preemptive way of someone who had been apologizing for things before they happened long enough that it had become the default posture. He was working the counter at Garrett's dry goods store, not his own operation, as Cole had been told, but someone else's, which told complete story about what 3 years had done to Jonas Webb's ambitions. He saw Cole come through the door, and his face did several things quickly. Recognition, dread, a brief and hopeless calculation about the back door. Then the resignation of a man who has run the numbers and found that the answer is simply to pay what he owes. Which Jonas did. All $400 counted out onto the counter with the pained attention of a man parting with something that hurt. Cole took it without ceremony. He was about to leave when Jonas cleared his throat. You're asking about the Aldrin fire, not a question. The statement of a man who had been holding information and had just decided the holding cost more than the releasing. Tom Peters mentioned it. Big man in a hide coat asking about kerosene. Cole turned back. Peters said more than that? Peters won't say more than that to anyone. He's got a family, and he's been here long enough to know which questions cost. Jonas glanced at the door, then back. But I'm leaving Rimrock, end of the month. My wife's people are in Denver, and I've been telling myself I'd go for 2 years. He met Cole's eyes. So I'm going to tell you this because I'm leaving, and because you have an honest face, which is rarer than people think. He told Cole about the morning after the fire. Before the sheriff, before anything official, Warren Cade's wagon coming back on the east road in the gray before sunrise. 2 men on it, the bed of the wagon carrying empty barrels. Kerosene barrels, Jonas said, because he knew the shape of them, had ordered enough to recognize them. Empty, I told the sheriff, Jonas said. And the flatness in his voice carried 5 years of something he hadn't been able to put down. He wrote it in his book and said he'd look into it. 3 days later, he ruled the fire accidental and closed it. He picked up a cloth from the counter and put it down again without using it. 6 weeks after that, my business partner had an accident on the North Road. Broke 2 ribs and a wrist, fell wrong off his horse apparently. He sold me his half of our freighting operation for almost nothing and left the territory within the week. Jonas looked at Cole steadily. I understood what that meant. I've been understanding it quietly ever since. Cole walked out of Garrett's into the cold morning air of Rimrock and stood on the boardwalk while the information settled into him. Jonas Webb, who had spent 3 years avoiding a $400 debt, had just handed him a witness account he hadn't known existed and would leave Rimrock before he could be used as leverage. The information was real, and it was useful, and it was also, on its own, not enough. He needed to understand the sheriff. Sheriff Roy Danner's office smelled like old coffee and stale paper, and the particular quality of a room where a man spent a great deal of time not sleeping well. Cole had walked past twice since arriving in Rimrock, and both times had seen Danner at his desk, pen in hand, not writing, not reading, looking at paper that was holding his attention about, as well as a wall-held conversation. Cole went in without knocking and sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited. Danner looked up. His face was 45 years old, but carrying about 10 years of additional weight in the currency of accumulated bad choices and their consequences. Dark circles that had stopped being the result of any particular night and had become structural. The careful stillness of a man who had learned to manage his own expressions the way you managed a fire in high wind, constant attention. No room for distraction. He knew who Cole was. That was clear before Cole opened his mouth, Mr. Hargrove. Careful, deliberate. The voice of a man choosing each step on uncertain ground, Sheriff. Cole let the silence run for a moment. I'd like to talk about the Thomas Aldrin fire, 5 years ago. The one you closed in 4 days. Dana's hands went flat on the desk. That case is closed, I know. Accidental lamp fire. Cole held his gaze. I'm wondering if that's what you saw when you were the first man on the scene. The silence that followed had a different density than the one before. Dana looked at the door, at the window, at his own hands. Every surface in the room except where Cole was sitting. You should be careful, he said finally, his voice low enough that it was almost not a statement. Strangers who make a certain kind of noise in this town tend to find it inhospitable. I'm not making noise. I'm asking a man I think might be tired of being careful what he actually saw the night 5 people died. Something moved in Dana's face. Complex and fast. The movement of a man who has been carrying something at a fixed weight for so long that he's forgotten what he weighed before the weight was there. And someone has just acknowledged the weight directly without asking him to set it down. Not yet, I can't, Dana said, barely above a murmur. Can't or won't. A long pause, then very quietly, both Cole looked at him, at the set of his shoulders, at the darkness under his eyes that had stopped being tiredness and started being architecture. He has something on you, Cole said. Whatever it is, it's been keeping you here for 5 years, being something you didn't sign on to be. He let that land. When the time comes, and it's coming, I need to know which way you'll fall. That's all I'm asking right now. Not a commitment, not today. Just think about which direction. He stood, picked up his hat, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. I'll be in touch, Sheriff. He walked out into the cold afternoon without looking back. Because looking back was the wrong move with a man in the middle of deciding, and he'd learned to feel the wrong move before he made it. He had what he came for. Not an ally, not yet, but the clear picture of Roy Dana, not evil, trapped. And a trapped man who wasn't evil was a different calculation entirely from a man who was both. He went back to Ruth's that evening to find June at the kitchen table with paper in front of her, and a pen moving across it with careful, deliberate strokes. Not a letter, something longer, more formal. She didn't look up when he came in. She was in the middle of something and was going to finish it before she stopped. Ruth put a plate in front of Cole without ceremony and sat at the end of the table. June finished the paragraph she was writing, set the pen down, pressed her palm flat against the page. Looked up, he's already started, she said. It wasn't a complaint, it was a field report. Mrs. Garrett came by this afternoon to return a mixing bowl. She was very careful about how she said things. The evenness in June's voice didn't waver. Apparently Warren was at the saloon last night. He told 3 men that I've been showing signs of nervous trouble since I was a girl, that my mother had the same difficulty, that he'd been managing it quietly for years out of family obligation. Ruth, from her end of the table. He's building a wall before you can speak through it, I know. June touched the pages in front of her, so I'm being specific. Every detail I remember from that night. Dated, signed, witnessed by Ruth. Walls built from doubt have gaps where specifics go. Cole looked at the pages, the careful, unhurried handwriting, the precision of someone turning memory into record. That's good, he said. It's not enough on its own, June said. You know that. Which is why I need Walt Briggs, Cole said. A direct witness who was present and can testify to what he did and what he saw. Paired with your account and the documentary evidence. It changes everything about what a public hearing can accomplish. June was quiet for a moment. Then, how long will it take you to find him? 5 days there and back if the road's clear. Maybe 6. He'll have 5 or 6 more days to talk to people while you're gone, I know. Cole looked at Ruth. What can you do while I'm gone? Ruth's expression was that of a woman who had been waiting to be asked something practical and was relieved to finally hear it. I know every family in this county that traded with Thomas Aldrin, that knew Eleanor, that sat in that church with them for 12 years. She folded her hands on the table. I can talk to people. Not asking anyone to do anything yet, just letting them know someone is looking at what actually happened. Letting a counter-story exist before Warren's is the only one, and I'll finish this, June said, gesturing at the pages. And I'll talk to Clara Webb, she knew Eleanor well, and she's been carrying this quietly for 5 years. She's ready to carry something else. She paused. And I'm going to go see Sheriff Dana. Cole looked at her. Dana is. I'm not going to ask him for anything, June said. I'm going to ask him one question. Her eyes were steady. What he actually saw that morning at the Aldrin property. I want to hear what happens to his face when I ask him that directly. Without you in the room, just me, she held Cole's gaze. That's mine to do. Cole looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. Ruth, put coffee in front of everyone. They sat in her kitchen with the cold settling outside and the lamp burning steady on the table, and they made their plans with the practical, unhurried efficiency of people who understood that the thing they were building had to hold weight before it could hold anything else. Cole left for Copper Ridge before first light the next morning. The moon was still up. Decker moved out of town at a steady walk, breath clouding in the cold, and Cole rode north through the pre-dawn dark of a territory that kept its own counsel on everything that happened inside it. The Cade property was a shadow at the edge of the valley as he passed. No lamps lit, no sign of movement. The smile at the edge of the porch stayed with him on the road north, in the way that things stayed with him when they meant more than they'd yet shown. The road to Copper Ridge ran north through country that didn't flatter anyone who traveled it. Red rock gave way to higher desert, and higher desert gave way to the first real elevation piñon pine on the slopes. Frost on the north-facing rock faces that didn't melt until mid-morning. The kind of terrain that was spectacular in the way of things that had no interest in being looked at. Cole rode at the pace Decker chose, which was efficient without being hurried, and let the miles go under them with the particular patience of a man who had learned that urgency spent itself on long roads and arrived at the destination already depleted. He thought while he rode, he thought about the shape of what he had. The document, the physical evidence he'd pulled from the Aldrin fire scene 4 years ago, in the days after the investigation closed too fast. Jonas Webb's account of the empty kerosene barrels on the East Road before dawn, and June's testimony, the most direct and the most costly of all of it, from the person who had been 15 years old on that wagon and had been paying for what she'd seen ever since. What he didn't have yet was a second witness who had been present at the fire itself. Someone who could stand up in public and say not that they'd heard something, not that they'd seen the wagon, but that they had been there and had watched it happen. Walt Briggs was that witness, if Walt Briggs could be persuaded to stop being Reuben Falk in a mining camp 120 miles north and become himself again in public. That was the question Cole was riding toward, and he understood it clearly enough to know it wasn't a question with a guaranteed answer. He stopped at a creek crossing on the first evening and made camp on the western bank, building his fire in the shelter of a sandstone outcrop the way he'd built thousands of fires in high desert country efficiently, with minimum smoke, positioned to hold heat without broadcasting it. Decker grazed on the dry creek grass with the uncomplaining pragmatism of a horse that had learned to find the nutrition in whatever was available. Cole ate trail food and sat with the fire and thought about Warren Cade's smile. A man that controlled didn't smile like that unless he'd already made his next move, which meant Warren had anticipated exactly this: someone finding June, someone taking her, someone starting to ask the questions that Rimrock had trained itself not to ask. He'd been looking for the document for months, across 2 territorial districts. He had contacts in the law enforcement system, clearly, or he wouldn't have been able to track Cole's movements as a former marshal. He had patience and he had reach and he had 5 years of practice at managing whatever threatened him. And he'd let June walk out of his yard with a stranger. That was the thing that didn't sit right. A man as deliberate as Warren Cade didn't make accommodations without reasons. He'd taken the copy of the document which he believed was the original, and he'd let them go. The smile said he believed he was still ahead of whatever Cole was building, which meant either he had something in motion that made the document less critical than it appeared, or he'd already identified the weakness in Cole's position and was waiting for Cole to walk into it. Cole fed the fire and watched the stars come out over the red rock and filed the smile under things to return to. The second day of riding took him into higher country, the scrub cedar thickening into actual stands of timber on the northern slopes, the cold acquiring a different quality wetter, with the particular edge that meant elevation rather than just latitude. On the afternoon of the third day, Copper Ridge materialized as a collection of rough wooden structures arranged along a creek drainage with no concern for aesthetics and every concern for function. Mining camps were built in a single register: get the ore out. The smell was mud and timber and the creek and the faint chemical residue of the processing operation, and the men moving through it had the particular posture of people who had arrived from somewhere else, and were actively not thinking about where. Cole asked about Walt Briggs at the camp office and received the look he expected, the carefully blank expression of a man who made it his policy not to know things about the people around him, because knowing things had consequences and consequences had costs. The man pointed toward the far end of the operation without making eye contact. He found him at a small open-sided work structure at the camp's edge, shoeing a horse with the focused attention of someone who preferred tasks that required looking down. Walt Briggs was 40 years old and looked like someone had added a decade to it through hard use, the accumulation of 5 years of running from something that couldn't actually be outrun, which tended to show on a person more than hard labor did. His hands were steady on the work, his shoulders were not. They carried a tension that didn't release even when he bent over the hoof, the specific tension of a man who had been waiting for something for so long that the waiting had become structural. He heard Cole's boots on the ground and looked up, and went very still, not surprised. The precise opposite of surprised, the stillness of someone for whom the moment of no longer waiting had finally arrived, and who was now on the other side of the waiting without knowing yet what was on the other side of that. You're not from the camp, no question in it. Cole stopped 10 feet out. Let the space between them be what it was. No, not here for ore, no. Walt set down the rasp he'd been holding, straightened slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who was not sure what the next few minutes were going to ask of him and was giving himself room to find out. He was bigger than Cole had expected, broad through the chest, nothing wasted about his build, but there was nothing threatening in the way he stood. Just the weight of someone who had been carrying something heavier than his body for too long and was no longer sure he could tell the difference between the two. I know why you're here, Walt said. Cole looked at him steadily. Then I'll save us both the time. I need you to come back to Rimrock. I need you to tell what happened the night Thomas Aldrin and his family died. The silence that followed had the texture of 5 years in it. Walt looked at the horse, at Cole, at something in the middle distance that had nothing to do with either of them. When he spoke, his voice came out rough at the edges, like it had been through something and hadn't fully recovered. I hear them, he said. The children, most nights. Clara had a piece of red ribbon in her hair worn thin like it had been used a long time. I don't know why that's the detail I can't let go of everything. That ribbon. He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. When Warren put that bar across the door, I tried to stop him. I said I wouldn't do it. He put his gun in my face and told me I'd already carried the barrels, and that made me as guilty as he was in any court in the territory. He met Cole's eyes. He wasn't wrong about that. Courts make distinctions, Cole said, between the man who set the fire and the man who was coerced after understanding what was happening. That distinction matters to a jury, especially with a credible account, and if the judge is in Warren's pocket, not the territorial judge. Warren owns the circuit court in Rimrock. He does not own Santa Fe. Walt was quiet for a stretch. The horse shifted its weight. The creek ran its indifferent course in the background. You sound certain? I am certain. I've seen certain men be wrong. Certain men who are wrong don't ride 3 days into the high country to find one witness, Cole said. And then he said the thing that he hadn't planned to say, but that was true. And sometimes the true thing was the right thing regardless of whether it was strategic. I had a son, Billy. 4 years old when he died. He stopped. Let it be what it was without dressing it up. James Aldrin was 4. I can't bring any of them back. But I can stand in that town square and say what actually happened, loud enough and in front of enough people that Warren Cade cannot manage the aftermath. I can do that, and I need you with me so I can do it right. Walt stared at him. The creek ran. Give me one night, Walt said finally. Cole took the one night at the camp in a bunk that had been designed without consulting anyone over 6 feet, which meant he slept at an angle that was more accommodation than rest. He was up before first light, dressed in the dark, and opened the bunk door to find it wouldn't open, locked it from the outside. He stood in the dark for 3 seconds with that information, then moved to the single window on the east wall. Small, the kind of small that a standard-built man would have found tight and that he found requiring a particular commitment. He got his shoulders through first, which was the critical geometry, and the rest of him followed in a sequence that he would not be describing to anyone who asked about his methods. He came out the far side, scratched along his left forearm, and missing his hat, which he'd had to push through ahead of him. 3 men were waiting on the near side of the bunk structure, not from the camp. Cole could see that at a glance the posture was wrong, the equipment was too new and too matched. The careful positioning of men who'd been placed rather than men who'd arrived. Hired work brought in from distance. Which meant Warren had known Cole was coming to Copper Ridge before Cole had fully decided to go. Someone in Rimrock had sent a rider north the morning Cole left. He didn't have time to work out who. He had time to work with the geography. The camp was built along the creek drainage, which meant the terrain on either side rose sharply. The eastern wall in particular was a broken series of rock shelves and cut gullies that a man who knew high country movement could use, and that men who'd been hired from a town context would find disorienting. Cole went up the eastern wall at a pace that was not elegant but was fast, and the 3 men below him found that following someone twice their size up a broken rock face in the dark required a recalibration that cost them the seconds Cole needed. He gained the top of the ridge, moved north along it for 400 yards, cut west down a loose shale gully that was unpleasant but passable, and came out on the far side of the camp near the rope enclosure where the horses were kept. Decker was where Cole had tied him the night before on the camp's western edge, which was where Cole always tied horses when he didn't know what the night was going to produce, and this instinct had been correct more times than it had been wrong. He pulled himself up left-handed. His right arm in the scramble up the eastern rock wall had connected badly with an outcrop not broken, he knew broken. This was something pulled in the upper muscle that sent a specific kind of white light through his vision and left his right hand operating at perhaps half of what he needed from it. He got his seat, got the reins sorted with his left hand, and put Decker west at a pace designed to put distance between him and the camp before anything else was decided. 2 miles out, at a creek crossing where the water ran shallow over flat sandstone, he stopped and looked at the arm in the gray pre-dawn light. Flannel intact, no blood. The pain had graduated from acute to the sustained, occupying ache of something that was going to require management for some time. He cut a strip from his bedroll with the hunting knife, wrapped the arm with his left hand doing most of the work, and made it functional if not comfortable. Then he put Decker south and rode toward the fork in the north road. Walt Briggs was sitting on his horse at the fork, his bag on the saddle in front of him, his face showing the particular quality of a man who had come to the other side of a night's decision-making and was standing in what the decision had produced. He looked at Cole, at the improvised wrap on his arm, at the way Cole was sitting slightly off balance to favor the right side. Something moved through Walt's expression that was not humor, not in this context, but was the recognition of a man who had watched Cole leave the camp under duress and had made a different choice than staying put. "They locked me in first," Walt said. "Came before you were up, told me to stay put and I'd be fine." He looked at the wrap. "You got out through the window." "The geometry was suboptimal," Cole said. Walt looked at the dimensions of Cole and the hypothetical dimensions of a standard bunk window, and for one brief moment, in spite of everything, something crossed his face that under other circumstances would have been a laugh. "I didn't run," Walt said, the almost expression settling back into something more serious. "I want you to know that. They moved me to the supply shed before sunrise. I got out when the morning shift change distracted the one watching the door. I came here. I know you didn't run," Cole said. "How?" "Because your horse is here." Walt looked at his horse, then back at Cole, with the expression of someone who had been given an argument they couldn't dispute. He turned south. "Can you ride the distance?" "I can ride," Cole said, which was true. Whether it was the full answer was something he'd deal with as the miles produced their own information. They rode south through the morning. The return road was 3 days, and they used them, not efficiently, not at the pace Cole had made coming north. The arm required accommodations that slowed him, and slowing him slowed the miles, and the miles were what stood between them and Rimrock. Cole managed it the way he managed most things that required endurance, by keeping his attention on what was at the end of it and treating the discomfort as information rather than emergency. Decker understood something was wrong before the first hour was done and adjusted his gait accordingly, which was the kind of thing that made Cole grateful for the particular horse, and not just any horse. Walt rode beside him, and they talked. Not about strategy, not about what came next. Walt talked about the night at the Aldrin property, in the order it happened, with the careful thoroughness of a man who had been keeping something in a sealed room for 5 years and needed to empty the room before he could stand in it and say what was there to anyone else. Cole listened without interrupting, because he'd learned long ago that there was a category of thing that needed to be said all the way through, and that the most important skill in receiving it was not filling the space. Walt talked about the barrels, about the road to the Aldrin property in the dark with no lamp because no lamp was the instruction. About Thomas Aldrin's face in the doorway surprised, doing his best to be hospitable about an unexpected late visit from a neighbor whose motivation he didn't yet understand. About Eleanor behind him with James on her hip, Clara in the hallway pulling her nightgown straight with the particular dignity of a 7-year-old who'd been woken up and felt strongly about not looking it. About the walk to the barn. About understanding what was actually happening at the moment the bar went across the door, and not at any moment before it. Which was the thing Walt had spent 5 years trying to forgive himself for the fraction of time between understanding and acting that had turned out to be the only fraction that mattered. About the gun in his face, cold and steady, and Warren's voice saying, "You carried the barrels, which makes you the same as me in any court in the territory, and you know it." About the drive back. About the silence of it. About the way Warren had driven with both hands on the reins and looked straight ahead the entire way, as though what had just happened was a transaction that was now complete and required no further attention. Walt's voice broke exactly once in 3 days. On Clara's name the second time he said it. On the second evening when he was going through the details again in the order the territorial court would need them. He stopped, held the break for a moment, then continued. Cole didn't say anything about the break. Walt didn't need him to. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the red rock of the Rimrock Valley came into view on the southern horizon, and Walt went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of the road. The quiet of a man looking at a place he'd run from and was now riding back toward under his own decision. "What happens to me legally?" Walt said, not a question. A man who was coerced at gunpoint after the fact, who ran rather than participated further, who comes back voluntarily to testify, that's a different legal position than the man who planned and executed it, Cole said. "I can't promise an outcome. I can tell you the distinction is real and that the territorial court will hear it. I don't need a promise," Walt said. "I need to say it out loud in front of people who can do something with it. What happens after that is what happens." Cole looked at him. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than most people manage." They rode into Rimrock on the 5th day from when Cole had left, the afternoon light already going flat and orange, the cold sharpening toward evening. Cole went directly to Ruth's. He would deal with Decker's feed, and his own arm and everything else in the order that things could be dealt with. Ruth was at the gate before he'd fully stopped. She looked at the wrap on his arm with the expression of someone whose professional assessment of the situation was already rendering itself unfavorable. She looked at Walt Briggs, whom she recognized that was in her face immediately. A rapid recalibration, something compressed and complete, 5 years of knowing what he'd done and hadn't done processing through a single shift of her expression. Then she stepped aside. "Come inside," she said, both of them, no qualification. June was at the kitchen table. She saw Cole come through the door, and her eyes went directly to his arm, the improvised wrap, the way he was carrying the right side with the quick, accurate inventory of someone who observed things the first time and didn't need a second look. Then her eyes moved to Walt behind him and went still. She knew who he was. That was immediate. The rapid reordering of someone who has been told a name and a history, and is now confronted with the actual person those things belong to. The weight of what they both knew, what they had both carried separately, in their different kinds of silence, for 5 years occupied the space between them before either of them spoke. Walt stopped in the doorway. He took his hat off. He looked at her across Ruth's kitchen with the face of a man who has traveled a long distance to stand in front of something he cannot make smaller by any method available to him. "I'm sorry," he said, directly to her. Not to Cole, not to the room, to June. Specifically, in the kitchen of Ruth Mercer's house, which was the smallest and most honest stage he could have chosen, and exactly the right one. June looked at him for a long moment. Her face was not forgiving and was not condemning something more precise than either, the expression of someone who understood exactly what the man in front of her had done and had not done, and was placing it accurately in her accounting of the world. "I know," she said, and then after a beat, "You're here now, not forgiveness, not absolution, the fact of the present moment, which was what it was and nothing more. But it was enough for both of them to stand on, which was what it needed to be." Ruth was already cutting bandage cloth with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman for whom the treatment of injuries was a known process that sentiment could wait outside. She looked at Cole's arm when he took the coat off the improvised wrap, the swelling that had developed over 3 days of riding, the limited range of motion he was managing, with the careful compensation of a man who'd been making do and made a sound in her throat that carried her complete and unfavorable opinion of whoever had allowed this to reach this condition. Since that person was Cole, he accepted the assessment without argument. "Not torn through," she said, pressing carefully along the upper arm in the specific places that told her what she needed to know, while Cole maintained the stillness of someone keeping pain out of his face by keeping it somewhere else instead. "Badly pulled. You have use of it. Not full use, that's 2 weeks minimum. Functional in 4 days if you're careful. I need it before 4 days. Your arm and your timeline are not in negotiation with each other," Ruth said. 4 days for functional. Careful means careful. She began wrapping it properly. The practiced efficiency of someone who had done this correctly hundreds of times and intended to do it correctly now, regardless of what her patient thought about the pace. Try not to make it worse. While Ruth worked, Cole looked at June. She was watching him, not calculating, not measuring, just watching the way you watched something you'd stopped trying to file into a category and had started simply seeing. "Tell me what happened while I was gone," he said. She told him. Warren had moved efficiently in Cole's absence, as they'd expected. The story about June's instability had reached every household in Rimrock. By the end of the second day, she heard versions of it from 3 different sources over 48 hours, each slightly different in its details but identical in its intent. The story about Cole cashed-out Marshal, morally compromised, being paid by outside interests to manufacture disputes over settled land, reached the saloon and the dry goods counter by the 3rd day. On the 4th day, a formal removal order had appeared at Ruth's door, bearing Sheriff Dana's signature and citing the property as in violation of town land ordinances, ordering it vacated within 10 days. "Dana signed it?" Cole said. "His signature. Whether he wanted to is a different question." June's hands were flat on the table, her voice even. Ruth sent the man away and told him to tell the sheriff to deliver his own paperwork. No one came. Cole looked at Ruth, who was tying off the wrap with a neat, definitive knot. "You sent it to me the same day?" "The morning the order arrived," Ruth said. "I assumed you'd want to know." Cole looked at the removal order sitting at the edge of the table where Ruth had placed it. Warren was applying pressure from every direction simultaneously, the story, the legal mechanism, the demonstration of reach, all of it designed to make the ground under their feet less stable before they could build anything on it. How did people respond? When you talked to them about the Aldrins? Ruth sat down, some closed up. "Fear is a habit in this, and habits don't break in a week." She folded her hands. "But Clara Webb, she sat with me for 2 hours. She told me things about Eleanor Aldrin she'd been keeping since the funeral. Tom Peters at the store, when I mentioned Thomas's name, stopped what he was doing and stood still for a long moment and then said, 'I always thought it was wrong.' He didn't say anything else. But he said that." She held Cole's gaze. "People know. They've known for 5 years. What they don't have is a way to say it that doesn't cost them more than they can afford to pay alone. That's what the hearing gives them," June said. 200 people saying it together is a different cost than one person saying it alone. Walt had been listening from the far end of the table, quiet in the way of someone who was absorbing what he'd walked back into. "He knew you went to Copper Ridge," Walt said. "Someone in this town sent a rider north the morning you left." "I know," Cole said. "Do you know who?" "Not yet. It matters less right now than what we do with the time we have." Cole looked at each of them in turn. At Ruth, whose face was the face of someone who had been waiting for this and was prepared for what it required. At Walt, who had come back to a place he'd run from and was sitting at a table in it, which was its own kind of courage regardless of what came after. At June, who was watching him with the grey-blue steadiness she brought to everything that mattered. "We post notices tonight. Hold the hearing the morning after tomorrow. 1 day to let the town absorb the announcement. Not enough time for Warren to put additional pieces in place. He'll be there, June said. He doesn't hide. He shows up and makes you feel like you made a mistake. Good, Cole said. I need him there. Silence for a moment. Then Walt, what do you need from me tonight? Cole looked at him. Write it down, everything you told me on the road in the order you told it to me. Dated, signed, witnessed by Ruth. That written account goes with the original document in a rider's bag to the territorial judge in Santa Fe tonight, so that regardless of what happens in that square tomorrow, the record exists somewhere Warren can't reach it. Walt pulled the paper. Ruth was already placing in front of him toward him. Picked up the pen and began to write, beginning with the barrels, beginning with the road in the dark, beginning with the things he'd been keeping in a sealed room for 5 years that needed to be in the light now, on paper, in his own hand, for anyone who needed to read them. Cole went out at midnight. He'd told June he was going alone, which produced a silence that he recognized as disagreement being held in reserve. She was standing in Ruth's doorway in her coat when he came out of the kitchen with the notices under his arm. You can't carry the hammer and hold the notices steady with one functional arm, she said. He looked at her. You should sleep. So should you. She already had the lamp. I'll hold. You hammer. He didn't argue, because she was right about the arm, and he'd learned that June Whitfield was right about practical things with the consistency of someone who had survived by being accurate. They went out into the cold midnight of Rimrock. The town was completely still, no wind. The cold sitting absolute on the street. Stars overhead with the particular density that only appeared at altitude on clear winter nights. Their breath made small clouds in the lamplight as they moved. June holding the lamp steady while Cole positioned each notice and drove the nails with his left hand, which was slower but got there. Garrett's store first. The church. The saloon's exterior post. They worked without talking much. The notices were simple public notice. The Aldrin matter. Rimrock Square. 8 o'clock morning, all welcome. No elaboration needed. The name Aldrin was elaboration enough. At the saloon post, June held the lamp and watched him drive the last nail. In the lamplight, her face had the particular quality of the night before, something that couldn't be undone, not fearful, not resolved in the performed way of someone convincing themselves, just present. Awake to what the morning was going to be. You should know, she said, while he straightened the notice against the post. On the pass. In February, Cole looked at her. When I found you at the bottom of that slope, you were very cold and not going to last the night without shelter. Something moved through her expression, not quite the humor it appeared to be on the surface, because underneath it was something else entirely. You're very large. Getting you up that slope was not a small project. I gathered that. I had to use the horse. I didn't know there was a horse. There's a great deal you didn't know. She looked at the notice on the post and then back at him. I left before dawn because I couldn't be found that far from the Cade property at that hour. If Warren had known I'd been out all night, it would have been, she paused, finding the precise word, costly. So I left, a beat. I thought about whether you'd survived. For months afterward. I thought about it most evenings. Cole looked at her in the lamplight. Thank you, he said. For the fire. For the blanket, he paused. For the horse. The thing that crossed her face then was not quite the almost humor from before. It was something more complete than that. Real, if brief, and it changed the whole arrangement of her face into something that showed what it looked like without the weight of 5 years pressing on it. You're welcome, she said, for all three, and turned toward Ruth's house. They walked back through the cold streets of Rimrock in the silence of people who have said what they needed to say and don't need to extend it past itself. The lamplight moved between them, and the dark pressed in around the edges, and somewhere on the other side of the night the morning was already on its way, carrying with it everything that had been building since the ridge above the valley where Cole had stopped his horse and listened. He did not sleep well. He hadn't expected to. He lay on Ruth's floor in the dark and worked through the order of presentation document first, for the why of it, establishing the motive before the evidence of the means, and somewhere in the working through, he found what he'd been turning over since Copper Ridge. Warren had known Cole was going north before Cole was fully committed to going. Someone had sent a rider. But the rider would have needed to know where north meant, not just north, but Copper Ridge specifically. which was not information Cole had shared with anyone in Rimrock except Ruth and June the night before he left. He lay still and thought about that for a long time. Ruth wouldn't. That was not a calculation, it was the kind of certainty that came from reading a person across a series of high-stakes moments and finding them consistent. June was not a possibility either. For reasons that went beyond logic into the kind of knowledge you accumulated from watching someone choose the harder right thing repeatedly when the easier wrong thing was available, which meant someone else in Rimrock had known, or had followed him, or had listened at Ruth's window on the evening he'd laid out his plans at the kitchen table, and the curtains had been closed, but the window itself had not been latched. He filed that under things that needed addressing before the hearing. Specifically, the route by which the rider Cole was sending to Santa Fe with the original document, and Walt's written account would need to leave Rimrock in a direction, and at a time that couldn't be anticipated. He got up at 4, went to the stable, and spent 20 minutes with the night duty rider who took messages south, paying double rate for a departure at first light from the East Road rather than the main South Road, with instructions to switch to the Pecos route at the first junction. The sealed envelope went into the rider's bag with the weight of everything it contained: 5 years of a dead man's careful act, 2 witnesses' accounts, and a cover letter that named names and dates and established a record that would exist in Santa Fe regardless of what happened in Rimrock Square in 4 hours. He went back to Ruth's, drank coffee in the pre-dawn dark, and waited for the morning to decide to begin. By 7, Rimrock was awake in a way it hadn't been in years, not festive, not loud. The specific quality of wakefulness that moved through a small community when something was about to happen that had a name they all knew, the kind of event that brought people out of their houses and into the street without anyone organizing them, because the organizing had already happened in the overnight conversation of a town that talked to itself through thin walls and shared fences, and the early morning movement of information that was a community's actual circulatory system. People were moving toward the square from all 4 streets. Cole watched them come as he set up the wooden crate in the open space, where Main Street widened before the church ranchers from the properties outside town who'd gotten word through the Trading Post network, working men from the mill, women who had known Eleanor Aldrin at church, or traded with her at market, or simply lived long enough in a place where something had been wrong for 5 years to feel the wrongness even when they'd learned not to say its name. Clara Webb was near the front of the gathering, arms folded across her chest, chin set, with the expression of a woman who had been waiting to hear something said that she'd known for years was true. By 7:30 there were 60 people. By 7:45, more than 100. By the time the church bell marked the hour, Cole counted closer to 150 more than he'd calculated for. Enough that the square was filled to its edges, and people stood 3 and 4 deep at the periphery. Ruth arrived with June and Walt from the East Street, moving through the crowd with the calm of people who had decided and were past the deciding. June caught Cole's eye across the square. She looked present, fully, completely present, with none of the internal monitoring he'd seen in her face in those first hours at Ruth's kitchen table. The watchfulness was still there, but it had been redirected, not toward calculating exits, not toward tracking threats, but pointed outward at the day, at the thing that was about to happen. He nodded. She nodded back. He stepped up onto the crate at precisely 8 o'clock. Wait was a thing you didn't do at the beginning of something like this. Every extra minute was a minute for doubt to find its footing. He let his voice go out across the square with the carrying quality that 10 years of presenting evidence to juries in open-air settings had given him. My name is Cole Hargrove. I was a United States Marshal for 10 years, Albuquerque District. I resigned that position 2 years ago. I am not here in any official capacity today. He let that settle. I'm here because 5 people died in Rimrock, New Mexico territory, 5 years ago, because the investigation into their deaths was closed in 4 days. And because the man responsible has been standing in this town every day since, and no one has said his name in connection with what happened. The square was quiet in the way that a crowd went quiet when something was said that it had been thinking for a long time and had not expected to hear aloud. Thomas Aldrin, Cole said, Eleanor Aldrin, James Aldrin, 4 years old, Clara Aldrin, 7 years old, and Pete Sully, who worked for the Aldrins and was sleeping in the barn that night. He named them in order, with the deliberateness of someone who believed that naming the dead was not a formality but an obligation. I want to show you why the ruling of accidental fire was wrong. Then you can make your own judgment. He presented the material in the order he'd worked out in the dark of Ruth's floor. The document first, Thomas Aldrin's legal transfer of specific grazing rights, properly witnessed, dated 3 months before the fire. He held up the certified copy and described what it was, what it meant, and what its existence gave Warren Cade a reason to want Thomas Aldrin gone. Not personal grievance, land, money. The arithmetic of a man who had decided that ownership entitled him to remove whatever threatened it. Then the physical evidence, the samples from the Aldrin fire scene, small glass jars carefully labeled. He described the difference between the burn pattern of an overturned lamp fire and the burn pattern of accelerant applied systematically from outside a structure. He described what he'd found at the Aldrin barn. He described what it meant. He used the precise, unhurried language of someone who had been reading fire scenes for a decade and didn't need to make the facts dramatic because the facts were. He was midway through the accelerant evidence when Warren Cade walked into the square. From the north end, 3 men behind him, the same build and posture as the men who'd been waiting outside Cole's bunk at Copper Ridge. 2 matched and 2 positioned to be local. Warren himself was dressed for a normal morning, vest pressed, hair combed, shoes that had been attended to. The studied normalcy of a man who intended to communicate that he was not worried by what was happening and had never been worried by it. He moved through the crowd, and the crowd parted not because they wanted to. Cole could see that, but because 20 years of doing this when Warren Cade moved through a space had made it reflex. He stopped at the near edge of the open area in front of the crate and looked up at Cole with the expression of a man who has arrived at his own property to find someone has rearranged the furniture without asking. Hargrove. The voice carried the warmth of a man greeting a mild inconvenience. Quite a gathering, Cade. Cole looked at him from the crate. Glad you came. Saves a step, Warren moved to the side of the square, positioned himself with his 3 men arranged behind him, and stood there. This was calculated, and Cole knew it was calculated. Warren's presence, his complete visible unconcern, was its own argument. It said, "Go ahead, say your worst. I have been here for 20 years, and I will be here for 20 more, and when you are finished, I will still be standing." He had managed this town from exactly this posture for as long as anyone in the square could remember, and the posture had always been sufficient. Cole stepped down from the crate and let Ruth up. Ruth Mercer did not need height. She stood in the open space with her hands folded, and the square paid attention to her, paid attention to something that was evidently serious, and did not intend to be interrupted. She told them about Eleanor Aldrin, not about the fire, not about what had been lost, but about Eleanor specifically, who she was, how she moved through the world, the things she'd said to Ruth in the months before her death. She told them about a conversation in which Eleanor had said, with the flat certainty of a woman who had looked at something directly and was not going to pretend she hadn't, that Thomas felt watched, that someone wanted the document gone more than they wanted anything else, that Thomas had sent it somewhere he trusted because he didn't trust anything local. She told them about Eleanor's voice when she said that, about the particular quality of a woman who was frightened and was being honest about being frightened because she trusted the person she was talking to. "Hearsay," Warren said from the side of the square, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Recollection of a dead woman?" Ruth looked at him. She held his gaze for exactly the right number of seconds, enough to be a choice, not enough to be a contest. "Yes," she said. Which is precisely what happens when the people who have direct knowledge don't live long enough to speak it in public. She held his gaze one more beat, then turned back to the crowd. She stepped back. Cole called Walt Briggs. Walt walked to the front of the open space with the walk of a man who was afraid and walking anyway, which was a different thing from courage in the performed sense, and was, Cole had always thought, considerably harder than that. He was pale. His hands were not entirely steady. He was not attempting to hide either of these things, and that turned out to be the right instinct. A polished witness was a suspicious thing, and Walt Briggs was not polished. He was simply present, and what he was carrying was visibly real. He told them about that night. In the order it happened, in the language of someone who had been through it once in real time, and once more with Cole on the road south, and was now going through it a third time, each pass making it more precise rather than more worn. 2 wagons, the kerosene barrels, the north road in the dark with no lamp because no lamp was the instruction Warren gave. Thomas Aldrin's face in the doorway, surprised and hospitable, doing his best. Eleanor with James on her hip, Clara in the hallway. The walk to the barn. The understanding arriving in Walt's chest like something dropped from a height at the moment the bar went across the door, not before. He was honest about not before. He said it plainly because he had stopped having any interest in making himself look better than he'd been. He stopped on Clara's name, 1 beat. Then continued. I tried to stop him, Walt said. I said no. He put his gun in my face and told me I'd carried the barrels, and that made me as guilty as he was in any court in this territory. He looked at the crowd, not at Warren. He was right that I'd carried the barrels. I have known that for 5 years, and I have been living 120 miles north under a name that isn't mine because of it. He paused. A man who's trying to save his own skin stays in Copper Ridge until the drinking finishes what the guilt started. I rode back here. That's what I'm doing instead, Warren, from the side. A confessed accomplice seeking to reduce his own liability. Walt turned and looked at Warren directly. The first time, a man looking to reduce his liability does not voluntarily return to the county where he committed the act and identify himself by name in a public square. His voice had stopped being unsteady. Say whatever you want about what I did. The facts of that night don't change because of who's saying them. The crowd was very still. Cole stepped down from the crate. He looked at June. She walked to the front of the open space without hurrying. The square shifted into a different register of silence than it had maintained through Ruth's testimony, and Walt's not the attentive quiet of people receiving information, but something more compressed, the held breath of a community that recognized it was about to hear something that mattered differently from everything else. They knew who she was. The ones who'd been in Rimrock long enough knew her as Warren Cade's stepdaughter, as the girl he'd kept close. Some of them had heard his story about her instability. Some of them had believed it. She turned slightly, toward the side of the square where Warren was standing, and looked at him, not at the crowd, directly at him, with the complete unwavering attention of someone who had spent 20 years learning to watch this particular man carefully, and was now doing it with nothing left to lose and everything left to say. Warren looked back at her, and for the first time since he'd walked into the square, something moved in his face that was not the controlled surface he'd been presenting. Not guilt, not exactly that. Something more like the recalibration of a man watching the architecture of his particular world rearrange itself in real time, and has not yet fully computed what that means. My name is June Whitfield, she said, and the square was quiet enough that her voice carried to the edges without her raising it. My mother came to Rimrock when I was 5 years old. She married Warren Cade 2 years after that because she needed safety and he presented the appearance of it, and she did not yet know the difference. She held his gaze throughout. I have lived in his house for 15 years. I have learned to move carefully in it, to take up as little space as possible, to not ask questions, to not look directly at things I was not supposed to see. I learned all of that because it was what staying alive in that house required, not a sound in the square. Warren Cade woke me before dawn on the night Thomas Aldrin died. He told me to dress. He said we were going for a drive. Her voice was the same voice she'd used from the beginning, no louder for the hard parts, no softer for the names. I didn't ask where. I had learned not to ask. I smelled the kerosene when I climbed onto the wagon. I didn't understand what it meant. I was 15 years old, she told them about the road. About Thomas Aldrin's face in the lamplight, the surprise, the attempt at hospitality, the trust, about Eleanor, and the children, James still warm from sleep, Clara's nightgown and her eyes confused and a question starting in her face that she never finished asking. About the barn, about the walk across the dark yard, about the sound of the bar going across the door from outside. I heard what came after, she said. She didn't describe it further, she didn't need to. On the drive home, Warren didn't speak to me once. When we pulled into the yard, he turned and looked at me, and he said, "Now you know what happens to people who have things I need." She let that sentence stand in the air of the square for 3 full seconds. I was 15 years old and I believed him. I believed that my silence was what kept the people I cared about safe. I kept that silence for 5 years. She looked at Warren for the last time. Clean final, The look of someone closing something that has been open too long. Silence doesn't protect anyone, she said. It only gives the dangerous man more room to move. She held his gaze for one more moment. Today it ends. Warren Cade moved before the last word had finished, settling into the cold air of the square. Not loudly. Not with the explosive quality of a man who had lost control. With the specific, deliberate economy of a man who had identified the lever and was pulling it, the same quality he'd brought to everything else in his life. The quality that had made him effective and had made him dangerous and had, for 20 years, made him the thing that Rimrock organized itself around without quite saying so. The gun came from inside his vest. It was pointed at Cole before most of the crowd had fully registered what was happening. Because Cole was the structure, he'd built the document case. He'd found Walt Briggs. He'd put the notices on the walls at midnight. Remove the structure, and the rest was disconnected pieces that Warren could manage separately, which was always how he preferred to manage things. Separately, one at a time, never letting the pieces find each other. The 3 men he'd brought from Albuquerque were positioned at the crowd's edge, hands moving toward their own weapons, and the crowd noise started at the periphery, the sharp collective intake that a gathered group made when something shifted from testimony to immediate danger. People at the edges moved back. People in the middle held, uncertain, looking at the gun, and then at Cole, and then back. Cole was already moving, left off the line of the shot, his right arm pulling with a specific white pain of something that had not recovered enough to be used this way, but was being used this way regardless. His left hand going for the gun at his hip. He had the reach. He did not have the time. His right side was slow in the way that injury made things slow, not absent, just late, a fraction behind what the moment required. He was going to be too late. He felt it before it finished being true. Warren. One word. From Warren's right. Carrying. The voice of a man who has decided something and said it before he could decide it back. Warren turned. Sheriff Roy Dana was standing 8 feet away with a revolver leveled at the center of Warren's chest. Both of Dana's hands were shaking. Visibly, unambiguously shaking, and he was making no attempt to hide it. The shaking was there, and the gun was there, and the gun was not moving, and those two things together said more than any controlled posture could have said. This was a man who was afraid and was doing it anyway, which was the only kind of courage that was ever actually real. His face was the color of ash mixed with old paper. He looked like a man who had gotten out of bed this morning without knowing what the morning contained, and had understood somewhere between his office and this square that it contained this, specifically this, and had walked here regardless. The square went absolutely still. Warren looked at Dana with the rapid, calculating quality he brought to everything, measuring distance, measuring the probability that Dana would actually pull the trigger, measuring whether this was real or whether it was a performance that could be redirected. He had managed Dana for 5 years. He knew the weight of what he had on him, the specific leverage, the years of accumulated obligation. He was running the familiar equation. Roy, the warmth in Warren's voice was the same warmth he'd brought into the square with him, the studied pleasantness of a man who expected to be listened to. Think about what you're doing. We have an arrangement. You know exactly what I have on you, and you know what happens to it if you point a gun at me in front of this town. Dana's hands shook. The barrel did not lower. You're right that you have things on me, he said. His voice was not steady, it had the specific unsteadiness of something being held in place by will rather than ease. And the distinction was audible. You've been right about that for 5 years. And I have spent 5 years being a different person than I was supposed to be. Because of it, he took one step forward, just one. I am done being that person. Whatever you have on me, let it come out. Let all of it come out. I'm finished hiding inside it, and I'm finished letting you use it as a handle. His jaw tightened for a moment then. Put the gun down, Warren. Put it down, or I swear on every name that woman just said in this square that shaking hands do not miss at 8 feet. Silence. Warren's 3 men from Albuquerque were running their own numbers. And Cole watched the calculation move through them, what they'd been paid to do against what was currently happening, the audience of 150 witnesses. A shaking sheriff with a leveled gun. The specific moment in which any action they took became something that 150 people would be able to describe to a territorial marshal in detail. They looked at each other. They looked at Warren. They stepped back, one at a time. removing themselves from the equation with the professional judgment of men who understood when a situation had moved past what their contract covered. Warren Cade looked at Roy Danner's shaking hands and the unwavering space between the barrel and his chest, and he understood something that perhaps he had not understood before this moment, that the leverage he had used on this man for 5 years had been effective precisely because Danner had believed it was worth what it cost him to cooperate with it, and Danner had just stopped believing that. Whatever Warren had on him, whatever the specific weight of the arrangement between them, Danner had decided it was less than the weight of what he'd been carrying since the morning he'd walked through the Aldrin barn and written down what he saw and gone home and rewritten it. The gun went down, slowly, with the control of a man who was going to lose this without losing his composure, because composure was the last thing he had, and he understood that Cole moved forward and picked up Warren's gun, stepped back. His right arm was presenting him with its detailed opinion of the past 10 minutes, which he filed for later. Danner walked to Warren with the careful, deliberate step of a man making himself do something 1 foot at a time, because stopping to think about it would mean stopping. He took the irons from his belt. His hands were still shaking when he fastened them around Warren's wrists, but he got them fastened, and the click of the mechanism was the most complete sound the square had ever produced. Warren Cade. Danner's voice broke on the name, and he let it break and kept going. I am placing you under arrest for the murders of Thomas Aldrin, Eleanor Aldrin, James Aldrin, Clara Aldrin, and Pete Sully. He stopped for one breath. And for everything else the territorial court sees fit to add when they hear what I am going to tell them. One person at the edge of the crowd began to clap. 3 beats. Then stopped, not because it was wrong, but because this moment wasn't that kind of moment, and everyone in the square seemed to feel that simultaneously. What this moment was something older and quieter. It was 150 people looking at a thing that had been in their town for 5 years, that many of them had known about in the way you knew about things you'd trained yourself not to name, and finding that it had a name now, and that the name had been said out loud by people who had paid real prices to say it. Warren Cade was walked across the square he had moved through for 20 years as though he owned it, which in every practical sense he had, and the people who had always stepped back for him stood where they were and watched him go. The afternoon after the hearing moved through Rimrock with the specific quality of weather, after a storm not calm exactly, but a different kind of pressure than what had been there before. Clara Webb found Cole outside Ruth's gate an hour after the square had emptied. She had a purpose in her step that had not been there when he'd first arrived in Rimrock, the purpose of a woman who had been holding something in place by considerable effort and had just been relieved of the effort. She held his gaze with the directness of someone who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it. Eleanor Aldrin taught me to make the best biscuits in this county, she said. I've been making them for 5 years and not telling anyone where I learned it, because telling anyone where I learned it meant starting a conversation I was afraid to have. She stopped. Thank you for starting it. She walked away before he could respond, which was exactly the right thing. Tom Peters came out of the dry goods store while Cole was passing on the street and stood in the doorway without saying anything for a moment. Then, I told the sheriff, 5 years ago, about the wagon. I told him and he wrote it down, and 3 days later the case was closed. He looked at the ground, then back at Cole. I should have done more than tell the sheriff. Yes, Cole said, because Peters deserved the truth, and the truth was yes. But you're talking about it now. That counts for something in the direction it's going. Peters nodded and went back inside, and Cole continued down the street toward the sheriff's office, where Roy Danner had taken Warren and was now, presumably, sitting with everything he'd just done and working out what came next. Warren's 3 men from Albuquerque had left Rimrock before the square fully cleared. They'd come for a job, and the job had changed shape in ways their contract hadn't covered, and men in that line of work were practical about such things. They would be a problem for the territorial investigation to locate, and Cole had already included their descriptions in the letter that had gone south with the rider before dawn. He found Danner in his office with Warren locked in the single cell at the back. Danner was sitting at his desk, both hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing with the expression of a man who had just done the biggest thing of his life and had not yet arrived at what that meant. Cole sat in the chair across from him without being invited. He'd done it before, and the dynamic between them had changed enough that it didn't need to be addressed. "You're going to need to transfer him to Santa Fe," Cole said. "Tonight or first light. Don't use the main South Road." Dana looked at him. The shaking had stopped. What was left was the thoroughness of a man who had put down something he'd been holding for 5 years and was still feeling the shape of where it had been. "I'll take him myself," he said. "I'm not trusting this to anyone else. I'll send a rider ahead to the Territorial Marshal's office." "Already did." Dana looked at his hands. "I wrote my full account this afternoon. Everything I saw at the Aldrin fire scene the morning after, the accelerant pattern, the specific things that didn't match an accidental lamp fire. Everything I wrote down the first time before Warren came to my office and told me what the cost of keeping those notes was going to be." He met Cole's eyes. "I rewrote the report. I made it say what he needed it to say." "I have lived with that for 5 years." Cole said nothing for a moment. Then, "The Territorial Court is going to want your testimony. All of it, including what Warren had on you, I know." Dana said it without hesitation, which told Cole that the deciding was entirely done. "Whatever that costs, it's less than what the alternative was costing." Cole stood. "One more thing. Someone in Rimrock sent a rider to Copper Ridge before I'd left town. Warned Warren I was going. I don't know who. You might or you might be able to find out." Dana looked at the desk. A careful expression crossed his face, not quite the evasiveness of before, but something he was sorting through. "Warren has a man at the livery." Lonnie gasped. "He watches people's movements, reports on who leaves town and in which direction." He paused. "I've known about it for 2 years. You're adding that to your written account? It's already in it." Cole nodded. "Then we're done for tonight. Get some sleep before you ride, Hargrove." Dana said it when Cole was at the door, and Cole stopped. She was very brave. In that square. What she did, he stopped, searching for something that was sufficient and apparently not finding it, because what she'd done didn't have a sufficient word for it. "I wanted you to know I understood that. What it cost her." Cole looked at him for a moment. "Tell her," he said. "Not me." He walked out into the cold evening street of Rimrock. Ruth's house was quiet when he got back, but not the quiet of absence, the quiet of people who had been through a great deal and were sitting in the aftermath of it, not needing to fill the space with anything. Walt Briggs was at the kitchen table with a mug in front of him, not drinking from it, looking at the middle distance with the specific expression of a man who had done the thing he came back to do and was now on the other side of it, working out what the other side felt like. Ruth was in the chair by the window, reading something or holding something, and looking at it the distinction wasn't quite clear from the doorway. June was on the bench on the front side of the house outside, in the cold, sitting with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the valley. Cole went out and sat at the far end of the bench from her. Not close. The distance they'd maintained for weeks. The distance that had been getting smaller without either of them formally acknowledging it. "Dana took Warren to Santa Fe himself," he said. "He's already written his full account. It includes things that are going to cost him personally. He wrote them in anyway." June looked at the valley. The light was going orange along the mesa rim, the cold sharpening toward the blue of full evening. "He came to me before you got back," she said. "He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands. He didn't ask for anything. He just said what he'd done and what he hadn't done and put it in front of me and let me decide what to do with it." She was quiet for a moment. "I told him I hoped wherever he went next would be good to him." Cole looked at her profile in the evening light. "Was that enough for you?" She thought about it with the genuine consideration she gave to things that actually mattered. "It was what was true," she said, "which is more than I've had from most people in this town for most of my life. So yes, it was enough." Walt came out 20 minutes later with his bag on his shoulder and stopped at the end of the porch. He looked at June with the face of a man who understood that whatever came next was going to require a new kind of accounting from him and was ready to begin it. "I'm going to Albuquerque tonight," he said. "My brother is there. He doesn't know where I've been for 5 years. I want to tell him myself before the trial makes it public." He shifted the bag on his shoulder. "I'll come back when the Territorial Court is ready for me. Whatever that requires, I'll be there." June stood. She looked at him in the last of the evening light, this man who had been the other half of her silence and was now the other half of the ending of it. "I know," she said. Same 2 words as before, but carrying something different now, not just acknowledgement, but the kind of understanding that required distance to arrive at, and had finally gotten there. Walt nodded, went to his horse, rode north out of Rimrock. In the gathering dark, Ruth appeared in the doorway. She looked at the two of them on the porch with the expression she wore when she had an opinion and was giving it a moment before she delivered it. "Dinner is getting cold," she said, and went back inside. June almost smiled. Not quite, but the edge of it was there, the thing that changed the whole arrangement of her face when it arrived. "She's been cooking since we got back," she said. "I think it's how she processes things." "She processed my arm the same way," Cole said. "Very efficiently." This time June did smile. Brief, real, the kind that showed what her face looked like without anything pressing on it. She went inside. Cole sat on the bench for another minute in the cold and the last of the orange light, looking at the valley that Rimrock sat in, at the mesa that ran along its western edge, at the sky that went from orange to violet to the deep blue of early evening in the high desert. He thought about the smile on Warren's face when they'd ridden out of his yard on the first morning. The smile that already knew. What it had known, it turned out, was that Warren believed he had enough levers in place, the document he thought he had, the sheriff he owned, the story he'd been building for months to absorb whatever Cole was bringing and redirect it. What he hadn't calculated for was the specific combination of Ruth Mercer, Walt Briggs, Jonas Webb leaving town, and June Whitfield deciding that 5 years was long enough. He hadn't calculated for Roy Danner deciding the same thing. The most dangerous variable in any situation, Cole had learned over 10 years of law work, was not the one you could see. It was the one that changed its own nature while you were watching something else. He went inside, ate Ruth's dinner, said very little, which suited everyone at the table, because they were all living in the aftermath of something large, and the aftermath had its own requirements. The afternoon after the hearing moved through Rimrock with the specific quality of weather, after a storm not calm exactly, but a different kind of pressure than what had been there before. Clara Webb found Cole outside Ruth's gate an hour after the square had emptied. She had a purpose in her step that had not been there when he'd first arrived in Rimrock, the purpose of a woman who had been holding something in place by considerable effort and had just been relieved of the effort. She held his gaze with the directness of someone who had decided to say a thing and was going to say it. "Eleanor Aldrin taught me to make the best biscuits in this county," she said. "I've been making them for 5 years and not telling anyone where I learned it, because telling anyone where I learned it meant starting a conversation I was afraid to have." She stopped. "Thank you for starting it." She walked away before he could respond, which was exactly the right thing. Tom Peters came out of the dry goods store while Cole was passing on the street and stood in the doorway without saying anything for a moment. "Then I told the sheriff, 5 years ago, about the wagon. I told him and he wrote it down, and 3 days later the case was closed." He looked at the ground, then back at Cole. "I should have done more than tell the sheriff." "Yes," Cole said. "Because Peters deserved the truth and the truth was yes. But you're talking about it now. That counts for something in the direction it's going." Peters nodded and went back inside, and Cole continued down the street toward the sheriff's office, where Roy Danner had taken Warren and was now, presumably, sitting with everything he'd just done and working out what came next. Warren's 3 men from Albuquerque had left Rimrock before the square fully cleared. They'd come for a job, and the job had changed shape in ways their contract hadn't covered, and men in that line of work were practical about such things. Cole had included their descriptions: height, build, the specific matched quality of their equipment. The Albuquerque origin Danner had confirmed in the sealed letter that had gone south with the rider before dawn. The territorial marshal's office would have enough to find them. He found Danner in his office with Warren locked in the single cell at the back. Danner was sitting at his desk, both hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing with the expression of a man who had just done the biggest thing of his life and had not yet arrived at what that meant. Cole sat in the chair across from him without being invited. He'd done it before, and the dynamic between them had shifted enough that it didn't need to be addressed. "You're going to need to transfer him to Santa Fe," Cole said. "Tonight or first light?" "Don't use the main south road." Danner looked at him. The shaking had stopped. What was left was the thoroughness of a man who had put down something he'd been holding for 5 years and was still feeling the shape of where it had been. I'll take him myself, he said. I'm not trusting this to anyone else. I'll send a second rider ahead to the Territorial Marshal's office tonight, Cole said. One already went this morning with the document and the written accounts. The second will carry your transfer notice and Warren's arrest record. Already wrote the transfer notice, Dana said. He looked at his hands. I also wrote my full account this afternoon. Everything I saw at the Aldrin fire scene the morning after. The accelerant pattern. The specific things that didn't match an accidental lamp fire. Everything I wrote down the first time before Warren came to my office and told me what the cost of keeping those notes was going to be. He met Cole's eyes. I rewrote the report. I made it say what he needed it to say. I kept the original notes. I hid them in the back of my desk for 5 years because I couldn't make myself destroy them and couldn't use them either. He paused. I have lived with that every day. Cole said nothing for a moment. Then, the Territorial Court is going to want your testimony. All of it, including what Warren had on you and what you did because of it. I know. No hesitation. The deciding was entirely done. Whatever that costs, it's less than what the alternative was costing. One more thing. Cole leaned forward slightly. Someone in Rimrock sent a rider to Copper Ridge the morning I left. Warned Warren I was going. Dana looked at the desk, not evasion sorting through. Warren has a man at the livery, Lonnie Gast. Watches who leaves town and which direction, reports it back. I've known about it for 2 years. He paused. It's already in my written account. Names, dates, what I observed, and the contact in Santa Fe, Cole said. Warren's man in the territorial system. He had someone there feeding him information. That's how he knew about me before I arrived in Rimrock, and that's why sending documents through normal channels wasn't safe. Dana nodded slowly. Clerk in the Territorial Court Records Office. Name of Hector Briol. Warren's been paying him for 4 years that I know of. Briol would flag incoming documents connected to the Aldrin land dispute and hold them before they reached the assigned judge. He looked at Cole directly. That's in my written account too. I overheard Warren mention the arrangement once. I wrote it down and kept it with the fire scene notes. A pause. I had a lot of notes I kept and couldn't use. Cole looked at him. Those notes are going to matter more than you understand right now. The Territorial Court will deal with Briol separately, Dana said. I know that. I'm prepared for all of it to come out. Cole stood. Then we're done for tonight. Get some sleep before you ride, Hargrove. Dana said it when Cole was at the door, and Cole stopped. She was very brave. In that square, what she did, he stopped, searching for something sufficient and apparently not finding it, because what she'd done didn't have a word that was adequate. I wanted you to know I understood what it cost her. Tell her, Cole said. Not me. He walked out into the cold evening street of Rimrock. On his way back to Ruth's, he stopped at the livery long enough to speak to the night man about a second rider going south before morning, then continued on. The territorial proceedings in Santa Fe were set for 2 weeks out, as Cole learned from the response that came back from the marshal's office 4 days after the hearing. He used the interim to manage the correspondence writing to Walt at his brother's address in Albuquerque, with the specific dates and the location of the courthouse, writing to the territorial judge's office to confirm the evidence package had arrived and been received intact, writing to former colleagues in the marshal's service who could speak to the context of the Aldrin case and the years Cole had spent carrying the document. He also spent those 2 weeks doing the ordinary things that accumulated when a person stayed somewhere long enough that ordinary things needed doing. He repaired Ruth's fence on a Tuesday. He helped Clara Webb move several crates that had been blocking her back storage room for longer than she could account for. He had a long conversation with George Aldrin, Thomas's brother, who arrived from Missouri 10 days after the hearing with the face of a man who had traveled a long distance towards something he wasn't sure he was ready to arrive at. George was 60. With Thomas's careful eyes and Thomas's quality of stillness, the stillness of a man who thought before he spoke, because he believed words were for meaning things rather than filling space. He stood in the square where the hearing had happened and turned slowly, looking at the buildings around it, at the cold sky above it, at the ground he was standing on. Cole found him there on a Wednesday afternoon and stood beside him without immediate comment. I didn't know, George said after a while. Not accusatory. Just placing the fact where it belonged. What happened? Nobody told me. I heard there was a fire. I heard it was accidental. I was 3 states east, and I believed what I was told because there was no reason not to. He looked at the square. I should have come. I should have asked more questions. Yes, Cole said. And then, because George also deserved the truth, but you didn't know what there was to ask. That's different from knowing and not asking. George was quiet for a moment. Then, Clara used to call me Uncle Gorge. She couldn't say it right until she was almost 5. She'd look straight at me with complete confidence and say Uncle Gorge. Like that was the obvious correct pronunciation, and the fault lay with the people who disagreed. He looked at the ground. I haven't let myself remember that for 5 years. Every time I tried, it led somewhere else to the other thing, to how she died, and I couldn't go there, so I couldn't go anywhere near her. He looked at Cole. Now I can remember it. Just the way she said my name, that small thing. I wanted someone to know I have that back. Cole stood with that for a moment. I'll tell June, he said, the young woman who testified. Yes, George nodded slowly. She should know. That what she did, what it cost her to say what she said, it gave me that back. The small thing, I'd like her to know it. Cole told him before he left about the territorial proceedings. About what was needed from George as the surviving family, a formal identification and the paperwork establishing his standing as Thomas's heir, and about the expected timeline for the land transfer once the case concluded. George listened with the focused attention of a man who had just discovered he had things to do and was ready to begin doing them. Cole rode south to Santa Fe the following Monday. He brought the original document, Walt's written account, his own 10-page testimony covering the full context of the case, including Thomas Aldrin's letter and the evidence from the fire scene, and Ruth's signed deposition. He also carried Dana's written confession signed in triplicate before Dana had left Rimrock with Warren, detailed and specific, including the original fire scene notes that Dana had kept hidden in his desk for 5 years, and the names of both Lonnie Garst and Hector Briol. The clerk Hector Briol was taken into custody by the Territorial Marshal's office on the 2nd day of the proceedings, after Dana's written account was entered into evidence, and the judge issued an immediate order. Briol's records showed 4 years of intercepted correspondence related to the Aldrin land dispute, 17 documents that had never reached their intended recipients. That evidence, combined with Warren's own financial records subpoenaed from the Rimrock Bank, established a paper trail that made the jury's eventual work considerably more straightforward. The courtroom in Santa Fe had marble floors and tall windows, and the formal weight of a place that understood its function was permanence. Cole had testified in rooms like it before, and felt the same thing he always felt, not awe, not intimidation, but the specific gravity of a proceeding that was going to exist in the record, regardless of what any individual in it wanted, and that gravity was the point. He testified first. Ruth testified the 2nd day by written deposition, her account submitted through the court's formal process because the roads had been uncertain, and Ruth had declined to leave Rimrock in December, on the grounds that someone needed to be there, which was true. Walt testified on the 3rd day in person, as he'd said he would, having traveled from Albuquerque with his brother, who sat in the gallery, and heard things about his brother's 5 years that he hadn't known before. Walt's brother's face throughout the proceeding showed the quality of a person absorbing something large and deciding not to look away from any of it, which was its own kind of steadiness. June testified last. She came into Santa Fe on the evening of the 3rd day, having ridden down with the Vasquez family from the South Rimrock Road. Cole met her at the hotel where the witnesses were being housed, and they had dinner at the hotel's small dining room, which was quieter and more ordinary than most of what had happened between them, and which had its own significance for that reason. "How are they going?" she asked. "Well," he said. Walt was precise and credible. Dana's written testimony has been the most significant single piece. His original fire scene notes, in his own hand, dated the morning after, are exactly what the physical evidence needed to be confirmed by. What happened with the clerk, the one in the records office, arrested on the 2nd day? His records are in evidence now. 17 documents over 4 years that never reached the judge's desk. Cole looked at his coffee. Warren's entire system for managing information is on the record. June was quiet for a moment. He built it so carefully, she said. Not with admiration, with the acknowledgement of someone who had lived inside the thing being described and understood its architecture from the inside. Every piece in place for years. And then one morning a stranger on a horse stopped in his yard. Cole looked at her across the small dining table. Decker stopped first. Something crossed her face that was not the almost humor of before, but was warmer than that the real thing, arrived at through the accumulated weight of everything that had gotten them to this table. Then Decker should get credit, she said. He already gets extra oats, Cole said. He doesn't need credit on top of that, she almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that he could see what it would look like when it fully arrived, which he had come to understand was only a matter of time in the right conditions. You should sleep, he said. Your testimony is tomorrow morning, I know. She looked at the window, at the Santa Fe evening outside it. I'm not worried about it, I know you're not. She looked back at him with the direct, clear-eyed attention she brought to things that mattered. Are you? No, he said. And meant it. I've watched you do things that were harder than a courtroom. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, said goodnight, with the practical directness she brought to everything, and went upstairs. Cole sat at the table for a while longer with his coffee, and with the accumulated evidence of the past months, everything that had moved since the ridge above Rimrock where Decker had slowed before he had, and found that what he felt about it was not relief exactly, not the discharge of tension, but something quieter and more permanent. The specific weight of a thing that had been unfinished for 5 years and was now finished. Thomas Aldrin's careful schoolteacher's hand. I'll know it when I see it, and if I don't see it, I believe you will. Cole had seen it, eventually, after 3 years of moving and not stopping. The next morning, June walked into the courtroom and took the witness stand with the same qualities she'd brought to the square in Rimrock, completely present, nothing held in reserve, nothing being performed. She testified for 2 hours with the voice of someone who had had 5 years to understand every detail of what she'd seen and heard, and was now placing each one where it belonged, in the order it happened, without qualifying things that didn't need qualifying or elaborating on things that were already clear. When the jury filed back in on the 4th afternoon, Cole was in the gallery. June was at the witness table, permitted to remain for the verdict at the judge's discretion. Dana, who had transported Warren and stayed for the proceedings, was in a seat near the back. The foreman read the verdict, guilty on all counts. June did not look at the foreman. She looked at Warren, who was at the defense table with the composure he'd maintained since the square. When the verdict landed, Warren looked down. 3 seconds, just 3. Then he arranged his face again and looked straight ahead. But June had been watching for those 3 seconds. She'd seen them, and something in her that had been braced against the possibility that even this might not be enough shifted into a different position. She stood, gathered her goat, and walked out of the courtroom before the judge finished his remarks. Cole followed. The hallway was stone-floored and cool and empty, and she was at the far end of it looking out the tall window at the afternoon street below. He walked to her. She didn't turn immediately. She was watching the ordinary traffic of Santa Fe going about its ordinary afternoon. He stood beside her and watched it with her. It's done, she said. This part, he said. The rest takes longer, I know that. I didn't say finished, I said done. She turned to look at him. Her face had the quality it had had in the square clarified. The expression of someone who has put down a weight they've been carrying so long that the absence of it hasn't fully arrived yet, but they know the arrival is coming. There's a difference between a thing being over and a thing being resolved. This is over. The resolution is the rest of my life. Cole looked at her. How does the rest of your life look from here? She looked at the window for a moment, at the street, at the pale December sky above the territorial capital. Like something I get to choose, she said, which was the most complete answer possible, and she knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them needed to add anything to it. Warren Cade was sentenced to hang and was executed on a cold morning in late February, and Cole heard about it by letter from the territorial marshal's office, written in the formal, factual language of official correspondence that did not elaborate on what the occasion meant beyond the legal facts of it. He read the letter at Ruth's kitchen table in Rimrock, folded it once, and went to find June. She was at her property, on the western edge in the thin morning light of a late winter day that was trying to become something warmer and hadn't quite gotten there yet. She was standing with her hands in her coat pockets looking west at the mesa, which in February was spare, and exact, the red rock showing its structure without any softening, the kind of clarity that came in the season before things started growing back. Cole handed her the letter without preamble. She read it, stood looking at the mesa for a while after she'd folded it. "All right," she said. 2 words quietly with all the weight properly distributed between them. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. The land transfer was completed 3 weeks after the trial, entered into the territorial record by the Santa Fe court. Thomas Aldrin's deed transfer, the document he'd sent to Cole 5 years ago, with the letter written in his careful schoolteacher's hand, was examined by 3 lawyers and a judge, and declared valid, and the property, including the silver vein that Warren Cade had been quietly working for 4 years on land he didn't legally hold, reverted to the Aldrin estate and passed to George. Warren's own property, the Trang Tri, the cattle, the house where June had spent 15 years learning to take up as little space as possible, was seized by the territorial court under the fraud statutes that applied when property had been accumulated through criminal means. The auction was held in March. Cole didn't attend, June didn't attend. The proceeds went by court order into a restitution fund distributed to the families of Thomas Aldrin's ranch hands who had left Rimrock in the years of Warren's management and whose departures had not, in all cases, been entirely voluntary. George Aldrin came back from Missouri to complete the paperwork. He met Cole in the square and they talked for a while about Thomas, about the property, about what George intended to do with the land he'd inherited from a brother he hadn't known, was in danger until the danger was 5 years past. He was going to hold the eastern grazing section, he said. The silver vein would be worked properly, with a legitimate operation and a territorial license, and the revenue from it would go partly to the restitution fund the court had established and partly to maintaining the Aldrin property until George decided what the long-term plan was. There was a parcel on the western slope, George said, good soil, morning light, sheltered from the north, that he wanted to deed over directly to the person who had the clearest claim on it, by right of what she'd risked to recover the truth. Before George left Rimrock for the last time, he asked to speak to June alone. Cole and Ruth went into the kitchen. The conversation on the porch lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When June came inside, she had the particular stillness she carried when something had just happened that she was in the process of receiving. She sat down at the table. Ruth put coffee in front of her without comment. "He's leaving me the western parcel," June said. "He said it was hers by right of what she did." A brief pause. "He used the third person. I don't know why. It was like he was announcing it to the room rather than telling me." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "He told me about Clara, about the way she said his name." Ruth looked at her across the table. "What did you say?" "I said that was good, that it was important." She looked at the mug. "I meant it, that he has that back, that she gets to be a little girl saying a name wrong to her uncle instead of only what happened to her." Cole looked at her from across the table. "He asked me to tell you that what you did gave him that back," he said. "I meant to tell you sooner." She looked at him. Then at the table. Something moved through her face, not grief exactly, but the thing that lived alongside grief in the long years after loss. Quieter, more complex, more permanent than the acute thing, and more honest about what loss actually was once you'd been living with it long enough to know it. "Tell him when you write him," she said. "Tell him I know." Spring came to New Mexico territory in the way that spring came to the high desert, not gradual, not the incremental warming of lower country, but a specific morning on which the quality of the air changed and everything that had been waiting under the cold surface of winter came through at once. Wildflowers in the rock crevices, the creek running high and fast from snowmelt. The light shifted to the angle that made the red rock look lit from within, instead of just colored from without. Cole went back to Santa Fe one final time in early March, not for Warren, not for the trial, but to complete the formal closure of his own involvement. A final deposition with the territorial judge's office, the official closing of the Aldrin case file under his name, and the last paperwork returning the original deed transfer document into the territorial court's permanent record where it belonged. Thomas Aldrin had sent it out into the world to be kept safe until the right time. It had been kept. It had found its time. It could rest now in a place where it would be harder to lose than an inside coat pocket. He also stopped at the territorial marshal's office to confirm what Dana's written account had set in motion. Hector Briol, the court records clerk, had entered a plea and received a sentence of 3 years and permanent removal from territorial employment. The 17 documents he'd intercepted were being reviewed for other cases that might have been affected by their non-delivery. Lonnie Garst, the liveryman in Rimrock who had watched departures and reported to Warren, was being looked at by the new acting sheriff who had been appointed to replace Danner. Neither outcome was dramatic. Both were the ordinary machinery of a system doing, belatedly, what it was supposed to do, cleaning up what a man like Warren Cade left behind him when the structures he'd built for himself were finally taken down. Cole rode north from Santa Fe in late March with the particular lightness of a man who has finished something that had been occupying him longer than he'd realized while it was happening. Not empty lightness, full lightness, the kind that came from completion rather than absence. He had 6 weeks of work to do before he came back to Rimrock. Not urgent work, but real work. The cabin in the high country where he'd left equipment and supplies that needed proper storing before the next winter. A conversation with the man he'd been guiding for 3 summers, who needed to know Cole's availability was changing. The final retrieval of a few things from the Laramie house he'd been paying a neighbor to look after for 3 years, without being entirely sure he'd go back for them. He went back for them. He stood in the Laramie house on a Thursday morning in early April and looked at the rooms that Sarah had arranged, and Billy had disarranged in the specific way of a 4-year-old who had opinions about where things should go. He took what he wanted to keep, not much, but specific things, chosen with care. Sarah's good iron skillet, a book Billy had been too young to read but had liked to carry around because the cover had a horse on it. A photograph, the only one, taken the summer before everything ended. He packed them in his saddlebag and rode south. He came back to Rimrock on a Tuesday morning in late May, on a morning when the wildflowers had reached the higher elevations, and the creek was still running with the last of the snowmelt, and the light had taken on the full quality of the season warm, decided, certain of itself in the way that the high desert became certain of its seasons once they arrived. Ruth was in her garden when he rode past her gate. She looked up with the expression of a woman who had been expecting him and had formed a complete opinion about the timing. 8 weeks, she said. I came fast when the roads were good, he said. She pointed west without looking up from her planting. She's on the parcel. He rode west. There was a foundation on the eastern-facing slope. Not a building yet, the stone foundation of one, carefully laid, the corners squared with the precision of someone who had thought about what they were building before they began. A kitchen garden had been dug on the south side, the soil turned and planted, the first green things already several inches up in the May warmth. June was at the far corner of the foundation, measuring something with a length of cord. She heard Decker on the slope and turned. She looked at him across the distance with the full, direct attention she brought to things that mattered. Confirming what she was seeing, she looked at the foundation. At him. It needs walls, she said. I can see that. Do you know what you're doing with stone? Stone, timber, adobe. Take your pick. She considered this with the seriousness she gave to things worth being serious about. Stone for the base, timber for the upper walls. She looked at the north edge of the parcel where the timber stood. The good wood is up there. I've been looking at it for 2 months. Then let's go look at it together, he said. He dismounted, tied Decker to the post she'd put in, a post that had been put in with the expectation of a horse, which told him the rest of what he needed to know without either of them having to say it. He walked, found the fusion, and looked at what she'd built in the weeks since he'd left, and the weeks before that when she'd had the land but not yet the full use of herself that spring had brought back. Ruth helped with the heavy cornerstones, June said, coming to stand beside him at the foundation's edge. The rest I did while you were gone. I had the time and it was better than waiting. He looked at the squared corners, the careful coursing of the stone, the solid base for something that was going to last. It's good work, he said. I know, no false modesty. Just the accurate assessment of someone who had done something and knew how well they'd done it. Where do you want the door? You're asking me where I want the door. It's going to be your door too, she said, with the directness she brought to everything that was simply true and didn't need to be dressed up as anything else. So yes, I'm asking where you want it. Cole looked at the foundation, at the slope around it, at the way the morning light came in from the east across the valley and hit the mesa wall to the west and came back gold. East-facing, he said. First light comes straight in. That's where I thought too, she said. They walked north to look at the timber together. In the May morning on her land, his land now too. In the way that things became yours when you chose to be part of their making and talked about what it would take to build something that would hold through the winters and the summers and all the seasons that came after those. A door facing east. Stone at the base, timber above. A kitchen on the south side where the garden was already going. Behind them in the valley, Rimrock went about the ordinary business of a town that had found its way back to something it had lost and was working out, day by day, what to do with the recovery. At Ruth's house, a batch of biscuits was cooling on the kitchen counter. Eleanor Aldrin's recipe, passed from Clara Webb to June across the long winter mornings after the hearing, practiced until June had it exactly right, and which she would bring to Ruth's table that evening, along with the people who had made it possible for her to have the time and the safety and the ground to learn to make them. On the eastern-facing slope, 2 people were measuring timber and figuring out where the walls would go. Cole had a photograph in his saddlebag and a cast-iron skillet and a child's book with a horse on the cover, and he was going to build a house to put them in, on land that was real and solid and chosen, in a place worth stopping for. That was what it looked like, that was what it became.